Teachers and professors have read what is the cleverest or dumbest way you've seen a student cheat? My PhD advisor shared this story with me. He was teaching an organic chemistry class, and after the exams, the students could look over their midterms and submit them for A grades if they believed there was a grading error on their test. A certain clever student used whiteout to turn a couple of particularly low scoring pages of his exam blank, then photocopied these pages. With these blank exam sheets in hand, he then correctly answered the questions on the page and used red pen to grade these funny correct responses as incorrect. He carefully restapled these pages into his original exam and submitted the doctored test for a A grade. When my professor saw how utterly horrible the grading errors were, he became suspicious. He went into lab and examined this exam under a black light. What he discovered confirmed his suspicions. 7/10 pages of the exam glowed green, while the other 3 pages, the ones with the blatant grading errors, fluoresced blue. Conveniently, the next lecture for the class was on photochemistry. He began this class by discussing the nature of fluorescence. He explained how many organic materials contain highly conjugated molecules that can absorb light and re-emit it at longer wavelengths. In fact, many naturally occurring materials, such as cotton, wood, and paper contain polymeric molecules called lignins that exhibit this property. He explained that different paper processing methods could lead to different ratios of these compounds, and thus no 2 batches of paper were ever exactly alike. He brought out the doctored exam under UV light, then demonstrated in front of the entire class how most of the pages of the midterm glowed green, but certain pages glowed blue. He then said to the student who submitted this exam, "And you know who you are, would you please see me after class? We need to discuss your continued enrollment at this institution." He showed up after class in tears and admitted the whole thing. He failed the course. Edit. Wow, glad you guys liked this story. Just wanted to mention, I asked my advisor about this today, and he confirmed with me that this story is 100% true. He also mentioned that there were approximately 400 students in the lecture hall when he did this demonstration. The sound of hundreds of students collectively saying "holy shit" was apparently ear-deafening. It took about 5 minutes for people to calm down enough for the lecture to continue. Edit 2. Thanks for popping my gold cherry. Be cool. Stay in school. TLDR. Student caught swapping pages of midterm and submitting for A grade. Gets caught by chemistry professor because, well, chemistry. ESL teacher here living in a foreign country faking students cheat all the time. It's terrible. I've seen some of the most clever cheating, and dumbest cheating. The most clever was when students would take their online quizzes. They'd have to take them in the lab on campus with a proctor. The test used to be set up so that it would give the students feedback and show the right or wrong answer for a few seconds on the screen. Students started taking pictures of these with their cell phones. Keeping in mind there are 6 quizzes per level and 4 levels, so we are talking about 24 quizzes at an hour 1.5 hours each. Enough students started doing this when the teacher wasn't looking. Classroom setup not really conducive to keeping an eye on every student all the time, that they had accumulated basically all the right/wrong answers for every question in every quiz. We teachers found out and had to throw away all our tests and rewrite them from scratch. One of the dumbest things I've ever seen was when I was teaching at a private degree Milish college. I taught night and weekend students who had no base of English, little time to study, and zero desire to learn. Some students, particularly elementary ed majors, literally spent more time and energy complaining about having to learn English than actually attempting to learn it. In one of these classes, there was a written, short essay test, another computer lab that was even worse as far as keeping an eye on students. Anyway, the assignment was to write about your favorite holiday, why you like it, and what you did last time. Mother's Day had just passed, so I made that one of the option/suggestions. It's worth mentioning then that the term Mother's Day was written in the instructions. Anyway, one of my students submits this essay talking about Day of the Breast, what she did on Day of the Breast. What happened was she used Google Translate, as many students do, and had zero language skill as for identifying misnomers and basic proofreading. So what's with Day of the Breast? She wrote Dia di la Mama in Google Translate instead of Dia di la Mama. Absolute dumbest. In a big university lecture hall of 300 plus students, I'm walking up and down the aisles keeping an eye on everyone shortly after the final exam has started. I look down one row and see that some clown has his notes spread out on the floor in front of him. There was nothing subtle about this. He had about a dozen pages spread out in a semicircle around his seat, clearly visible from either side of the row. I suppose he thought that, if he sat in the dead center, about 25 to 30 seats, no one would notice from the aisles. He was not correct on this. I walked over and asked, in what was meant to be a whisper, "What the fuck is this?" It did not come out as quietly as I had intended. I had not meant to curse either, but I was just utterly flabbergasted. You wouldn't have thought the room could get any quieter, but somehow it did. Every pen stopped. Boy Genius looks down at the notes, as if just noticing them, and, almost offhandedly, says, "Oh, those aren't mine. They were here when I sat down." My TARS and I had cleaned up after the previous exam before the students came in, so this was certainly not the case. They were also pretty obviously written in the same handwriting as his exam. I collected the notes, informed him that he's welcome to finish, if he would like, just in case he wants to later plead his case to the Academic Judiciary Committee, but that he should not expect to be passing the course point he finished the exam. He did not pass the course. Okay, not a teacher, but a student with a long history of cheating. Sometimes really dumb ways of cheating, sometimes really good ways. Dumbest way I have probably ever cheated. Taking Japanese 101 in high school and I copied all the vocab on my phone. Proceeded to have my phone out and look back and forth continually from my phone to the test. The teacher definitely noticed, but never did anything about cheating students. Probably my smartest way I ever cheated was taking an online course in college. We have 2 exams, which they use an exam proxy for to make sure you aren't cheating. It's really elaborate. They IP your computer, so they can see your screen the whole time, and they have a live proctor watching your movements through video the entire time. If you leave the screen at any point, this being a 2-hour final, you fail. Also, before and after you take the test you have to rotate the computer around your entire room and show them your desk, so they can see that there is no notes/something to cheat with around you. Essentially I got my friend to help me out, and we made a setup where I was sitting on a table in front of my TV, which was hooked up to another computer, in my living room. My friend hid behind the couch in the living room, where I was taking the test, so he wouldn't show up when I spun around my computer for the beginning part. Then when I got started on the exam he crawled out, then logged onto the TV in front of me. He would glance over at the questions on my computer. I was very carefully angling my camera so he couldn't be seen. Then he would look up and highlight the answers on the TV screen. All I had to do was glance at the TV for a moment to get the answer to all my questions. When I finished, my friend turned off the TV and crawled away so I could do the closing procedures. I got an A, even though I literally knew like 1/10 questions on the test. The idea was mine, but my friend was the true MVP of the story. I bought him in and out after to say thanks. I was an adjunct professor last year, and I had a student submit a very strange paper in my ESL composition class. She was a particularly plagiarism-prone student who had copied more than half her work for this class off the internet. No, I couldn't drop her from the class. The college would never refuse international students huge tuition payments. Lately, I'd been running her work through multiple plagiarism checkers. This one was an essay on a trip she supposedly took to Hyderabad. It was completely incoherent, so I initially thought, okay, maybe she's writing her own work for a change. Then I figured out through trial and error that she was taking material from the internet and running it through an article spinner. For those unfamiliar with the concept, an article spinner is basically a program that lets you plagiarize by plugging in someone else's writing and changing words to their synonyms. For instance, my friend and I walked to the store, my companion and I went to the supermarket. It's usually for content farms that want to use spun versions of other people's articles or reuse their own articles, not really for students. I figured it out because she identified the Spanish mosque in Hyderabad as the Spanish language mosque and wrote about Ramoji movie city, actually Ramoji film city. Other gems: Chuck soccer ball, the fresh oxygen would move, party effectiveness. Also, random capitalization and other weirdness far beyond the normal ESL writing mistakes. Other great moments from students in that class: the student who submitted an essay that I had used as an example in that class, the student who managed to plagiarize a handwritten in-class essay by copying it from her phone I should been watching more closely, the student who submitted a plagiarized essay on how to avoid stress while studying, I guess that's one way, and finally, the student whose final essay was a memorized and regurgitated copy of an essay that he had submitted earlier in the semester, which was itself apparently copied from another student's essay from a different semester, which, I don't know how deep that rabbit hole goes. This wasn't really cheating, more an accidental gaming of the system. When I was at university, during my second year I needed a second year extra course to fill out my schedule, and I chose Philosophy 202 Existentialism. Problem was the seminars were at 9 AM, so I just ignored those, which would have been noticed by my tutor during the mandatory tutorial group lessons, except since so many people were using Philosophy 202 to fill out their schedule, they let us pick our own preferred tutorial group time via sign-up sheets. I didn't sign up, which meant I wasn't on anyone's attendance list, and so couldn't be marked down as missing. The grade was 100% final exam, and I figured I had plenty of time to catch up later anyway. Fast forward 6 months, and I'm on my way down to London for a giant party weekend with some friends, when I bump into a mate from my course at the train station. He's just been home to see his family, and I wondered why he came back before the weekend. Because of the Philosophy 202 final on Monday morning. It's 100% of our grade. Oh, seat point anyway. Went down to London, partied hard, and then slightly hungover. I went to a bookstore on Sunday. Picked up Sartre for Beginners. It was basically a book of bullet point explanations of Sartre's views on existentialism, and every page also had a comic strip of Sartre saying a quote from one of his books in a funny situation. To illustrate the point, I read the book on the train back. It was actually quite good point. Yeah, you get where this is going. I aced the exam second in my year. Turns out, the phone book-sized philosophy books they had been studying in class were denser than diamonds, and the graduate students who were supposed to be helping were terrible teachers. No one in the entire year had a clue about existentialism, except me and one other girl, who got the top grade, since I had learned it all in easy to understand bullet points the day before, and even knew lots of quotes to back up my arguments, since all I had to do was recollect the funny comic strips depicting Sartre. So yeah, not cheating, but I did manage to graduate second in my class in a course without attending a single lecture or class, using only a Sartre for Beginners. In my first year as a teacher, I taught in a low-ranked district. It was so bad, most of my students didn't care enough about their grades to cheat. Really? So in my second year, I was almost inspired to see that my students created a class-wide cheating conspiracy for my vocabulary test. I noticed that some students were taking a very long time for this very easy test, and some of those students would be sitting there with nothing on their papers for most of the period. But by the end of the class, they would have come up with all the right answers and hand it in on time. One student would do the test for real. This was a good but corruptible student. She would then stall before handing it in long enough for another student or two to copy. Then, either by passing notes or sending texts, the other students would each send their answers to 2 or more other kids. And so on, until everyone had the answers. I got suspicious the first time, pretended not to be watching the second time, and then created several separate tests the third time. I nailed them with that point. Looking back, I know that the whole thing was my fault, because I created a test that was so completely based in rote memorization. I didn't know any better. It was my second year in a district that wouldn't know what to do with a good teacher, if it got one. Since then, I've worked at my craft, and now I'm in a great district. I got here by learning to see assessments as part of the learning process, and not an end point for a unit point in this information age. All teachers should be using assessments that are cheat-proof, authentic activities that require each student to utilize skills that are taught to synthesize information. If you're giving tests that ask students to memorize Google-able information, you're basically asking your students to cheat. Not a cheating story, but I'm currently finishing a master's program at an elite university, but I'm doing so remotely. Overall, it's been a very positive experience, and while I miss the interaction you have with classmates and professors when you're in the same physical room together, I've enjoyed the process and learned a tremendous amount. Most of the classes have final papers, others final projects, and a scant few have final exams. Some of those are working exams, so they are effectively open book, since it's showing a process and way of thinking instead of answering a B, C, or D. One of my classes, though, was a multiple choice test, and it was proctored online. This means that while I took the test, there was a person, mostly college-age students working part-time, watching me through a video chat window to make sure I wasn't reading off of a cheat sheet, and they could monitor my desktop to make sure I wasn't googling answers. There was a 15-minute check process where I had to prove I didn't have notes hidden anywhere, even holding my laptop up to a mirror to prove there weren't notes taped around the edges of the monitor. This was all fine. I'd studied and was well prepared for the test. The test, however, was 3 hours long, and there were no scheduled breaks. I began the test with a glass of water next to me. An hour in, the glass was empty. 90 minutes in, my bladder was full. I wasn't going to make it another hour and a half. I asked the proctor if I could take a quick restroom break. They were very apologetic, but said I couldn't leave their view without invalidating my test, which would cause me to automatically fail. Gritting my teeth, I tried to tough it out. Sweat beads started collecting on my forehead, even though it was the middle of winter in the upper Midwest. I checked my watch, thinking at least a half hour had passed. It had been just a few minutes. I wasn't going to take this test again. So calmly, deliberately, I grabbed my empty glass, put it underneath my desk, unzipped, I'm a dude, and relieved myself while seated in my chair. When I finished, I placed the glass back on the table, far away from the laptop, then went back to the test. I wish I'd screen grab the proctor's video window. Their expression was priceless. When I was a student, one of our teachers was a real dirtbag. He would give straight A's to students that he knew cheated in all the tests and assignments. He even kept quiet when he caught the people cheating, but only for a few select students. I decided, fuck this, I'll cheat too. Then I sat by the wall for the final exam and placed my smartphone sideways inside my round pencil case so that it rested with a screen facing me and the lock button where I could reach it. He couldn't see my phone, since from the back, all you could see was my pencil case. I copied all the answers off my phone, and every time he would walk by to check if anyone was cheating, I would nonchalantly move the pencil case to face the wall, and then pretend to reach for a different pen when I wanted the phone to face me again. Now that I'm a teacher though, I make sure all students leave their phones at my desk, and the smart ones often bring a decoy phone. No bags are allowed under their tables, and no papers on, under or beside the desks are allowed. I monitor girls with short skirts because they often write on their legs. And I don't allow people to keep their water bottles on the table, cause a student once wrote all the answers on the back of the label of the Coke bottle she had. Pens and other writing tools must be taken out before the tests, and the pencil cases must be put back in the bags. I make it pretty hard for them to cheat, but a lot of them still do. I don't stop them sometimes, but when I see them, I automatically fail them. I'm quite the beach. Edit. Just for clarity, I'm female. I don't monitor the other girls cause I'm interested. First off, my students are adults. Yes, adults try to cheat too, and I keep an eye out only cause I'm used to the cheat tactics. First time post here, no native speaker, be gentle. When I was in the Canton Schule in Switzerland, which would roughly translate to senior years in America, last 2 years before university, we had this professor for French literature who was teaching French. Obviously we couldn't be nearly good enough for his standards, which surprisingly didn't make him frustrated or angry. He was always calm and composed. His tests on the other hand were really hard, which wasn't that big of a problem, because he didn't care too much if we cheated either. Only cheating methods that were really dumb made him take your test away. So one kid in class had this idea of printing out a text in form of a shoe sole, and because the sense of community in the class was rather good, He printed them out for everybody. Right and left shoe, with all the important vocabulary and info. So 15 minutes before the start of class, everybody was gluing these papers under their shoes, so if they lay one leg over the other they could read it. And if they had both feet on the ground the prof couldn't see it. The test began, and something curious and unexpected happened. Whenever the prof walked down the middle aisle of the room, everyone behind him crossed their feet and everyone directly in front of him put their feet down. As we was rather smart, he quickly realized this, and began taking steps forward and backwards, dancing a little bit, and waving his finger like an opera conductor would wave his wand. After 10 minutes of this, no student could concentrate on cheating anymore, because they were trying to silently laugh their asses off. In the end the prof just stood in the back smiling, and let us finish the exam not caring about us cheating, because we has amused him so much. One of my better memories from school. Needless to say, all our marks were really good. Let me tell you about app biology. I took this in high school, and would have a test after every chapter. My teacher was really shitty, and would just read the pre-made slides that the book provided for teachers. After the first 2 tests, both my section and the other app section all received pretty bad grades. She would sometimes even leave a class and go to her office, allowing those of us with smartphones, the good old days, when it was impressive to have an iPhone, to Google a few answers, but it didn't help much. Naturally she saw our bad grades, and made the tests open note. We were even allowed to print out her book slides and use them. Well, me and my table partner also figured out that her tests were the book tests, and the answers to every question were on a website I'll leave unnamed. You could say it was like a hero for my course. We started printing out the answers and slipping them in with our notes. We would purposely get a few wrong to get that 97 or 96 as to not draw suspicion. Other people in the R class and eventually the other section heard about it, and we started printing out copies for everyone. By the time of the final, she had figured something was going on, and she said she was going to check our notes for the final. For our coup de grace, we took her slides, deleted the information, replaced it with bullet-pointed answers, and distributed it to everyone. She checked everyone's notes with a once-over glance on test day. Not a single person was caught. Oh, and pretty much everyone got a 1 on the app exam. We learned nothing. TLDR, started a cheating ring in high school for app biology, and no one got caught. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. I've caught my students doing all the normal things to cheat, but I've had 4 methods that I told them at the end of the year were going to be stories for the next year. Had a student write the rules of exponents on his black and white shoelaces. During the test he bent over to tie his shoe. He would have gotten away with it if he had better short-term memory, but he did it again a few minutes later, and I noticed it. I had a student print a copy of a water bottle label, but she changed the label to include the formulas for the different ways to factor polynomial equations. This one I expect I missed a time or 2. However, regardless of how close your bestie is, I know you aren't sharing your water to be nice. When I have a water fountain in the classroom. I had a honors student meet another student from my standard class in the bathroom and answer all the questions. They posted a paper with all the solutions in the men's bathroom and were telling people to go to the bathroom to get answers. You may think you aren't being noticed, but over the course of 5 classes I will definitely pick up on the increase in bathroom use. I didn't check the bathroom until the second to last block, when I had my planning. Catching everyone was easy, since I only had to check which guys signed out the bathroom pass, and check their test vs bathroom solutions. One of the problems was wrong, so they stuck out easy. I had a class that was taking a multi-choice test who all came up with a scratching system. They'd scratch their nose, neck, head and arm after silently tapping their feet for the problem. Again, you may think I won't notice, but half the class was acting like they had run through poison ivy. I mean, come on. Edit, fixed autocorrect errors. One enterprising student had a regular everyday T84 calculator that was modified and hollowed out to fit an Ocafy phone. The board that holds the membrane switches for the keys was attached to its faceplate and removable, and the guts were pushed up behind the display. Basically, the number pad just popped off, revealing half the phone's screen, and the back had a tiny hole for the camera point. During finals that year, I had 4 classes, back to back. In the short break before the third class, a few students came in and complained that some students in the second class already had answers to the test. I can't randomize the test for each class. The university requires I give every student a pre-made final approved by our department head. They said it was unfair, that they were studying, and a few students were just memorizing some questions. They said someone was using a calculator to cheat somehow, and even told us who the student was. The staggered testing time for this class was on WED. But I usually offer an extra credit assignment for students who come to class on the third or free following the exam. This particular student showed up. I had them all clear their things, except pencil and calculator, then passed out the assignment. I left the room and instructed my tutor to tell the class he had to excuse himself and would be right back. Then we both watched through the door as the cheating student in the back of the room removed the top plate and photographed the extra credit assignment points. So basically, this one student was in a class scheduled early. He would photo exams and things and pass them on to his friends. In fact, it was a good portion of an engineering fraternity, though there is no way to prove who received the answers. There is no telling how long this was going on as far as how many semesters, though just looking at the registration tells me it was probably 15 or 20 people for just that one class, going by fraternity relation. The photographer was completely removed from the university and likely has no hope to transfer to another school without completely starting over. This was a class on electrodynamics using Jackson, so as you can imagine, it wasn't early in his university career. The interesting part is that the calculator worked perfectly. The seams on the keypad fit perfectly. The main board for the calculator was not normal. It was some sort of smaller hobby kit running the TOS. It was honestly really nice work and I'm kind of impressed and disgusted at the same time. Edit. I just read the smartwatch phone post from /u/always lurk it until now. My story is before smartwatches existed. So I guess I have something new I should look out for now. TLDR. When I was in high school, we had a graph calculator that we were able to write little program to help us calculate things. CT86 calculator. You were also able to write text into those programs, and some kids wrote physics and chemistry formulas into those software to use them on the exam day. We had to remember those formulas, and it was considered cheating to have formulas in your calculator. So on the beginning of every exam, the teacher would take all graph calculator and go through its settings and clear the programs all at once. To be fast, since he had to go to all the 20, 30-ish students, he would always do the shortcut keys, say press those buttons, and then press 5, then 2 and the memory was cleared showing a message on the screen. One day I had an idea, what if when the teacher come to clear the memory, I'm running a program on the calculator that fakes all the steps that the teacher does to clear the memory. I was pretty good at coding softwares on the calculator, so I programmed that software XD. So basically, the software was faking that the teacher was going through the options and clear the memory, but in fact it was a fake software running in background of the calculator and the teacher wasn't really clearing the memory. The funniest part is that I was really good in science and I didn't need that software. In fact, I never used it. But some of my friends had the software and used it to keep some formulas on their calculator. Some of them told me that I made them pass their science classes. TLDR. I made a software in high school that faked the memory clear process of a graphic calculator, allowing me to keep notes in the calculator, even if the teacher cleared the memory. In college I was generally a pretty shitty person in regards to integrity, but I did what it took to get by. I used to ask classmates for help on programming projects pretty regularly. Basically for every project, we'd be in the lab for multiple hours working on this stuff, and when they would get up to get a drink or go to the bathroom I'd just swap their flash drive from their computer to mine, and then copy everything from it, and then plug it back in before they got back. That minute they were gone always made my heart race. The interesting thing is I took a class on lexical analysis that outlined essentially how compilers scan through code, identify the different tokens, keywords, order them, and then process them. My professor at the time even mentioned they use this process to scan our projects and can use it to identify copied code or shared projects. based on the order of the different tokens, lexicons etc. So with this knowledge and my classmates' projects, I would take all of their code and rewrite it, change the location of the identifiers so the token order wasn't the same, or create additional functions so that it still performed the same but was essentially written differently. It's comparable to taking a paragraph from a book and paraphrasing it. It still says the same thing, but in another way. I would also intentionally make my programs not function 100% completely. The students I copied from were smart, and I knew they'd finish the project. So to differentiate mine from this further, I'd make it have 85% functionality and take the grade hit. Because frankly on my own I wouldn't have been able to make it that far. Never happened to get caught the multiple times I did it, but to this day I'm still a terrible coder, and I'm sure this only helped contribute to it. Needless to say, I don't program for a living or plan to, but hey, at least I was applying the knowledge I gained from that lexical analysis class. TLDR, I spent more time learning how to cheat effectively than it would probably take to just learn how to do the damn projects. As a student, I had to take a 2-part test in my art history class. The entire class couldn't take the second part until the third part. The way the test worked was the teacher would put images up on the projector and you would need to write down the name of the work, time period, and the artist point. So during the first half I did terrible. I had a complete brain fatch and couldn't seem to focus. I was sitting in the middle of the row and we had to pass our tests to the front. Since I was going to have a few tests in my hand, I decided to sneakily crumple mine up and put in my pocket. If she lost part of my test, it wouldn't have been my fault. To me this was a genius idea. We took the second part of the test and I felt I did really well. Now I can't remember how or why, but she ended up going through all the tests before we left. She said my name and my heart dropped. She was wondering where my test was. Everyone else was confused too. I just acted like an idiot and said I didn't know. She made me stay after class and retake the first part. For some reason it all came back to me. Can't remember my grade, but I got at least a B. That was good enough for me. TLDR, 2-part test. Everyone had to hand in the first half before we could all get the second half. Crumpled up the first half because I thought I did bad. Teacher noticed my first half was missing. Didn't accuse me of anything but made me retake first half. Did better the second time on the first half. I had a student who somehow got the answers to another teacher's multiple choice test. The other teacher recycled tests from year to year. A pretty common practice. I told the other teacher and told him to watch out for it. I usually don't bust kids in my class for cheating in my class because it could be a special situation, or a teacher allowing work sharing, or just someone copying notes. But I always tell the other teacher. So the other teacher says thanks, but assures me that it is such a long test that the student couldn't possibly remember more than a few letters. I knew the student well, and he was pretty dim. He told me not to worry, he would find the cheat sheet and bust him. The test comes and goes. The kid gets a 100%, but the other teacher can't figure out how. He gave the kids everything, booklets, exam, and had them take off their jackets and roll up their sleeves to take the test. Nothing. The only thing they were allowed to use was their own pens or pencils. This didn't sit right with me. The kid was a C student at best. So a day or two after the test, I'm walking up and down the rows while me students write, and I notice this kid's pencil has these little marks all over it. It isn't writing, just little nicks in the sides. So I go and sit down and email the other teacher to send me the answers to the test. He does. I then get the kid's pencil. Actually, I ask him if I can use it for a second when he comes up to hand in his work. He says sure and hands it to me. I put down the pen I was writing with. Like I said, this kid wasn't too on the ball, and I really looked closely at it. The test had 4 possible answers for the questions, and the nicks were arranged so that they were pointing in one of 4 positions. Not up and down, but on the diagonal point. Turns out that was how he did it. And I had to re-evaluate how smart he was, because although it failed, it was pretty creative and subtle. Not a teacher, but I did cheat just one time. I was an intelligent student who just didn't give a fuck, but still aced every exam. Naturally, I befriended fuck-ups who, usually, failed every exam. For the history final that year, I came up with a scheme so I could hang out with my buddies when they'd otherwise be in summer school. It was a really long multiple choice test, but everyone had the same test. All of the questions and answers were in the same order on every page. Too easy. We, two others and myself, were all in different corners of the room. But setup was similar to theater in the round, everyone facing the center. Each accomplice was assigned the leg closest to them. Toe tap 1, 2, 3, or 4 times for answers A, B, C, or D. Pretty basic, I know. Here's where I feel it gets interesting. A heel tap 1, 2, 3, or 4 times meant I'm intentionally giving you the wrong answer. I did this for each of them for random questions, so neither got the same ones wrong or the same amount of correct answers in a row. We got the 3 highest final grades in the class, but different scores: 100, 97, 94. The teacher absolutely suspected cheating once the grades were out, but all 3 tests looked totally different. In the end, they both still went to summer school for other subjects. Oh well. TLDR helped friends cheat on a final to keep them out of summer school. Past W/O getting caught, but they went to summer school for other subjects anyways. This is something I did in college once. Even though it isn't technically cheating, it was a pretty cheap trick, and it fits fairly well in this thread. I was in an advanced paleontology course, and during one of our applied exams, we were given a map of a fictional island with multiple rock formations, faults, fossil layers, etc. Our job was to write a paper giving a detailed geologic history of the entire area, including what the original paleo environments were, and what relative age of everything on the map was. I could have answered the question how it was intended, but I felt like going out on a limb, so I invented my own answer, which obviously wasn't correct, but it could fit if you really tried. To fill in the obvious holes, I cited fictional papers that backed up my fictional assertion. 17 pages later, I had a masterfully written story detailing the origin of this place. When I finally got the test back, it had an A on it. I was honestly surprised this worked. After class, my professor, who is brilliant and very well respected in her field, albeit a little naive when it comes to practicalities, pulled me aside and said, "Your paper was amazing. Where did you find all of those sources?" I informed her that a fictional island of geologic interest most likely had fictional papers written about it, and of the papers our university's library let me access online, the ones I found just happened to perfectly fit my explanation. She then realized what I had done and wasn't very pleased, but agreed to let me keep my A if I could answer the question correctly, which I did after class. Words. Technically not the question asked, but I took an online nutrition course my freshman year of college, where the professor would actually copy-paste random Quizlet questions and answers to our fill-in-the-blank tests without checking if they were right. She did this so that the number of potential questions was so large that we couldn't just take photos and share them between each other, since the chance of getting the same question as someone else was pretty low. I realized it once a few questions on hyperthyroidism showed up on one of the tests. Having the condition myself, I have done a lot of research on it, so I thought I was going to get an A for sure. When I got a surprisingly low grade, I checked to see the questions I got wrong and the answers. It was all the questions on hyperthyroidism, and the answers that were right were all of these exotic mutations, where babies would be born with tails and deformities and sheet, basically like those snake baby pictures that blew up a few years back. I emailed the professor about it, explaining that I think that my online quiz was having problems because I have the condition that was in question, and I didn't understand how some of the answers didn't add up for me, forgetting that she never actually saw me in person. I guess the teacher just googled the deformities that she put as the answers, because she emailed me back with a super sympathetic letter about all the stuff I must go through on a daily basis, and that she could open not only that test back up but also all future tests for me to take at home instead of at the testing center. When I took the same test at home, I googled one of the questions and the first result was a Quizlet with all the other answers to the test on it as well. The kicker is the questions she would mark correct were actually wrong enough that it could lower some letter grades. I passed the course because oddly enough the only way to do well in it was to look up the answers, but I picture the professor being all high and mighty after thinking that she helped a crippled kid through a tough time. TLDR online teacher from my school copy pasted wrong Quizlet answers, passed me because she thought I was a snake baby mutant. Not a teacher, but I have a story of a dumb cheater. Back in high school I took an automotive repair class. The class was full of stoners who had no desire to be in class, and I was the guy who didn't smoke and really wanted to learn how to do basic maintenance on my future car, so I was a bit of an outcast there. There was this one kid who did nothing in the class. The only thing he would do is try his hardest to annoy people sitting around him. He would sit beside me and try to take my phone out of my pocket, and the one time he succeeded he dialed 911, and I had to go deal with a bunch of shit with that. He was kicked out of the class more times than I can count. On the day of the final written exam, he's sitting beside me, and I notice him keep glancing at my paper. Since I know all the answers, I just start writing down bullshit. Multiple choice, same thing. I just select random letters that I know are incorrect. I glance over and sure enough, he's writing the wrong answers down. I wait until he's handed the test in, erase all my old answers and circle the correct ones. The written exam wasn't the final day of class, since the week after there was a practical exam. 2 days later the teacher comes up to me in class and pulls me and that kid aside. He asks what we were playing at and puts 2 exams in front of us. The kid beside me had been so focused on copying my exam he had written my name at the top of his test, but his own name at the bottom of the test. I told the guy the truth, that I'd noticed this guy copying me, so I put some wrong answers down, then corrected the answers at the end. Teacher failed the other guy, and I got a 97% in that course. Not a prof, but a cheater in college. I took Orgo and Orgo second. Organic chemistry. Organic chemistry is hard, but organic chemistry lab is psychotic. Literally the most difficult and all retentive of labs. At least labs required for med school. I'm sure other assholes are going to pipe up about their labs, but fuck off and I in your pure science poverty. Anyway, I went to a hellish school where they used mass spectrometers and other mechanisms to evaluate the correctness and purity of your sample product, and that evaluation was the single major component of your grade. So Orgo lab is hard, and these goddamned labs were 2 credits per. Given how insanely competitive our school was, and how everyone was gunning for a GPA over 3.5 to apply to med school, every credit counts, and these goddamned labs counted double of all the other labs' friends, and I had the bright idea to simply order the end product from chemical supply firms, thank you Sigma Aldrich, and add the pure chemical to our vials of dog shit product. We were smart enough to just add enough product to boost our grades, but not enough product for it to be overly suspicious. Word to the wise, it is virtually impossible to make 100% product of anything, anywhere. Ask Walter White. Even his blue was in the mid-90s, using the best stuff, the best equipment and repeated, perfected process. It sure as fuck isn't happening whilst hungover and in the subterranean organic chemical labs using shitty equipment from the 1950s. Now imagine what meth labs run by faking meth heads are putting out. Good job, Meth America. You faking idiots. A few years later, I run into a couple college friends who were 2 years below me at school. They were keyed into our schemes, so I asked about how Orgo lab went. I had figured they'd followed our plans and done well. Apparently, some dumb sheets at our school were also told of our scheme, and when they had Orgo lab, they simply handed in pure samples, direct from Sigma Aldrich, and of course they were caught. From then on, you had to hand in samples from every step of the process. Womp womp. TLDR, stupid legacy kids fuck things up for smarter kids in college. At university, in the computer lab as one of 100 students doing a invigilated online multi-choice test for my BSc. Clicking anyway, when my friend sat on the other side of the room uses Netson to send an alert box to my PC, bit like MSN. What the answer to question #2. Only it bings really loudly when it arrives at my machine. The whole room is under exam conditions and my machine is binging. I send a reply and hear it binging on her machine from 5 rows away. There are 2 IT professors between us invigilating. Don't bat an eye at the 2 PCs binging away the rest of the test. With nets and there is no way to hide the incoming message. I'm at least being cautious and making sure there are no invigilators walking near my friend when I reply. She's less bothered. Sends message just as guy walking behind my desk. He spins round, looks at my screen. Must have seen the super OBV alert box on my screen. Walks on point. Honestly, out of 30 Qs I must have answered 17 or so of hers. So that's like 34 messages / bings right there. Never mind the numerous thanks, cheers, are you sure, and really replies to my answers. I finish, but hang around to make sure my friend has finished too. Last thing she does is send me an SMS to say she's finished and she'll buy me a drink at the pub. We are literally going to speak in 10 seconds. As soon as we walk out the room, completely superfluous message. At this point the one of the invigilators actually announces whoever it is who keeps making their machine bing, can they please stop? It's very distracting to other students. These were university level IT lectures. Quite how they didn't realize what was going on is beyond me. This is a little bit of neither, but is the best cheating related story I have. The configuration of our classroom is pretty stupid, with 3 giant tables that all the students sit at, so you can easily see 5 other tests from the average seat. So when I give a test, I have them open their laptops with the screens facing me, which makes it a bit harder to see neighboring tests. I also give them 4 separate tests, same questions, just mixed around. So we recently took a test on causal web diagrams. On one of the sections, you're given 4 bubbles that say A, B, C, and D. You just have to draw the arrows between the bubbles according to the instructions. It's pretty simple in theory, but the vocab trips most people up. They have to figure out how to draw things like correlation, mediation, feedback loops, etc. Overall, my curve on the test is good, not great, in case you were wondering. Anyway, just with the 4 bubbles, there are at least 100 different ways to draw arrows for 4 bubbles given all permutations. I tell them this, making a point of the fact that there's only 1 or 2 correct answers. So if they happen to give the same wrong answer as someone else nearby, it will be obvious that they copied. I tell you, it's ridiculous. I've got arrows going every which way, some of them don't even land on a bubble. I'm not talking about a wrong answer, I'm talking about an impossible answer. The kind of answer that barks I have no idea what I'm doing. I breathe a sigh of lamentation and keep grading. Looky here, I see the exact same gibberish. What are the odds? Oh, and wow, they sit right across from each other. I write, see me. The worst part is having to confront students about cheating. I tell them what the consequences are, and that both students will receive the consequences if neither admit the fault. I realize it's not entirely fair, with a mention of how it's not fair to me either, wasting my time and putting me in an impossible position, but it's the best we can do. The lesson for the person who didn't cheat will have to be to guard your answers more carefully. Then I hope that someone speaks up and point out that the punishment for them will be the same regardless. It's just a question of whether they take an innocent person down too. Unfortunately, most have more pride than integrity. They twist in the wind to come up with a plausible explanation, or sometimes they try to save face by saying, I didn't do it, but I'll take the blame. Oh, that one is just my favorite. So you didn't do it, but you want to take the punishment, let the other person off, and not have anyone actually believe that it wasn't you. Nash's equilibrium will be thrilled about this new discovery in social dynamics. This discovery is sure to get me tenured someday. So I've seen some students overreact about accusations of cheating, but one day this girl comes in with a gun. And she starts telling me about how the other girl must have cheated off of her, and how her 4.0 is ruined, and if she doesn't get into the program she wants she may as well die. I'm just completely floored, and no idea what to do because A, gun in my room, and B, how can I possibly talk this girl down, when she will surely be expelled, or put in a psych ward? There is nowhere to go from here but down, down, down. So I tell her to relax, we'll figure this out, put the gun away, and let me just get your test from the other room. And I'm out of there. I call security and explain the situation, and they are asking me if I feel like I'm in danger. I don't know. They say to try to get her to put the gun away if I don't feel like I'm in danger. I'm kind of taken aback because I wasn't expecting to be part of the solution here. This doesn't seem like the protocol, and also feeling kind of guilty for wanting to have nothing to do with this. For the next 3 minutes I'm just paralyzed by uncertainty. Do I take off, clearing the building in case this girl becomes homicidal, or do I just casually stroll back in and talk to her? I could say it was a mistake, or that the other girl already confessed, or just try to talk her down and convince her that it's really not the end of the world. Now I'm the one twisting in the wind, and in the moment cheating on a test feels like the most innocent thing in the world. Finally, after what felt like the longest 3 minutes of my life, the security guard arrives. Finally someone who will know what to do. I want to believe, but I know that this person is probably as caught off guard here as I am. He's got that feral, high alert look in his eyes, which gives me no comfort. He comes up to me and asks if I'm the one who called it in. Yes, I say, and I have no idea what to do. I explain this whole situation to him. He's still wide-eyed through the whole explanation, but nodding his head, and then he says, "Okay, sir, just relax. We've already called in a specialist who should be here soon. Right now we just need to ensure everyone's safety. First, I'm going to need about Trifidi. I'm not very good at ending stories, so this is what I'm reduced to. Sorry." When I was in high school I cheated mostly on history and English tests, the occasional chemistry test. I was never caught. My secret was to use the technique very sparingly. I never just tried to get an entire answer set. That's untrustworthy anyway. All the teacher has to do is mix up the order of the questions or give a different test point. My trick was remarkably straightforward. We were told to put all our books under the desk. I just left my open notebook and placed my feet on top of it. To the unobserving eye I was following every rule. When needed I would glance at the floor, part my feet, answers were revealed, etc. Like I said, I use lots of moderation. I studied and knew the basic information. It was just the little details that always screwed me up. Many tests I found that simply preparing a cheat sheet actually taught me the answers and I never had to go to my cheat sheet for the actual test. Other times it was a lifesaver. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the teachers knew I was cheating and just didn't stop it, but I like to think I got away with it. I was certainly never called out on it. I would never encourage anyone to cheat, but at the same time I see no point to memorizing lists of facts. It didn't help history and just proved that some people can memorize things. I've learned more about history after school by reading, watching, and talking about things that fascinate me. I learned that the morality aspect of it is terrifying. I took a test for work just a month ago. Didn't cheat. Thought about it. Thought hard. But didn't. Failed the test. I get to hold my head up high and know that I'm a man of my word, which honestly is more important. Don't cheat. It's a terrible habit to develop. It's like the light side and dark side of the force. The dark side is alluring and tempting, and easy and satisfactory at first. But when you wake up, and you're 40 years old, and you realize your entire life is a sham, and you raise the shotgun barrel to your temple, you will come to the conclusion, probably shouldn't have cheated. Then a soft click. Then peace. And then the eternal fires of hell for not having accepted Jesus Christ as your savior. Oops. Well, that got a bit rambly. Not a teacher, but fuck it. This is probably my favorite cheating story from my academic career. A bit of backstory. I attended a very prestigious academic high school in Boston, where other than provide its students with a quality of education to match, they often employed crappy teachers and maintained a curriculum wherein students were inundated with an absurd daily workload from 7th grade onward. You can only attend IM for 7th or 9th grade if you score high enough on an exam. Each graduating class has about 20 to 25 certifiable geniuses who get to pick which IV they'd like to attend for free. Everyone else is forced to cheat to get by. I fell into the second group. My junior year, I had a very crappy calculus teacher, and I was too busy trying to keep up in other classes, while also turning my brain into mush every day during football practice to bother teaching calculus to myself once I got home. Cheating at my school was rampant and usually collaborative, so if you take the exam first, you're effectively obligated to help everyone taking the exam later. This usually means giving a heads up about what the exam actually covers and important tidbits to remember. My very crappy calculus teacher taught 2 junior classes. Because of the way our daily schedules rotated, my class almost always had to take exams first, so I relished any help I could get by. On this day I was not taking the test first, but second. By second period a friend from the other class had decided to become my favorite person in the world, and provided not only all of the correct answers, but the work needed to be shown for full credit. We were allowed a sheet of notes during the exam, so this could all simply be copied onto a sheet of paper and simply copied onto the test point. I made my copy and passed it along. Of the 30 kids in my calculus class, something like 15 were walking in with all the answers. When we sat down and our exams were handed out, I knew absolutely nothing that I needed to for this test, but I couldn't have felt more confident, relieved even I finally had the answers ahead of time. Paying it forward was finally coming back around to me. But I will never forget this. The instant my friend Christine looked at the exam, she literally shouted across the room, "It's not the same test." All year, my very crappy calculus teacher had only made one version of his exams, and the only time I actually got to take the exam second is the only time he faking bothered to provide an adequate defense against cheating. I was so stunned that I basically pretended to not even hear Christine. But after looking at the exam myself, I could no longer suspend disbelief I had the answers to the wrong test. Having prepared for this exam even less than usual, I literally had no idea what to do, so I just copied the answers and the work shown that I had been provided. I turned my exam in and left disgusted that I would be getting a 0 in a class where I was already struggling mightily. Our tests were returned to us shortly thereafter, and I was prepared for the worst. I turned it over and saw a red 63 at the top. I don't know how my very crappy calculus teacher failed to notice that I had provided the exact answers for the other version of the test, or how else he thought I might have done all of the calculations and processes correctly while also writing down the wrong faking numbers from the problem listed directly above. But I have never been happier to get a 63 TLDR. Fuck you, just read it. Sheet. This'll probably get buried, but way back in middle school I had a class that was just a madhouse. The school lost a French teacher. He looked exactly like Vincent D'Onofrio and wanted to replace him with a native French speaker. All they could find on such short notice was a guy from Togo. Nicest guy in the world, but didn't have the slightest understanding of how school worked. He was following a fairly standardized syllabus, or the class would have been entirely unproductive. Anyway, he administered the final, which none of us had bothered to study for, because middle school, and also because the class had become a joke at that point. People would get up and walk across the room to their friends' tables, and if he asked them what on earth they were doing, they just responded, "I don't understand the instructions, so I'm asking so and so." People would throw crayons at each other and then go across the room to retrieve their crayons and ask their friends about the answers. I asked him if I could use a calculator for a French test just to see if he'd let me. He did. It was one of those graphing calculators that you can take notes on. The kicker? Despite all of this blatant cheating going on, he was very insistent that we prop up empty folders in front of us to guard our tests from wandering eyes. What's worse, he let anyone who didn't have a folder with them use their textbooks. I wound up scoring a 75 raw score, which he corrected to a 98%. My best friend, who was actually studious, started with a 92 and wound up with a 115%. My theory is that he had no understanding of why certain practices, like cover sheets and assigned seating and curves, existed. He just knew that they were very important things. Because he didn't understand why those things were important, he didn't notice when they were misapplied. Throwaway plus VPN, because I'm paranoid that I'll get backtraced and reported to the cyber police. Not a teacher, but a student. I had an English teacher last year who was all about things being in on time. For an English paper, we were going through the motions of writing a term paper. because I already knew the process, having learned it 4 other times the exact same way. I couldn't care less about the steps associated with writing the paper, just let me write the faking paper. We were at the point where we had to write these notacards much more tedious and time consuming than they sound for our paper, and they were due to Turnitin.com on Friday. Because I was lazy that week, I didn't submit them. Note that our teacher ruled that each day late, including weekend days, meant 20 points off out of 100, which was a sheet load in her class. I decided that my excuse would be to say that Turnitin.com faked up, that I did in fact submit them, and that I had no idea why nothing was showing up on the website. Now all I needed was something to back up those words. Turnitin.com sends a confirmation receipt to the user's email each time they submit something. I forged a receipt using the standard email program on Mac, did the work over the weekend, and had them ready to submit Monday morning. Monday morning arrives. Teacher calls me out. I claim that I did submit them. She calls BS. I show her email receipt. Allowed to use laptops. Awarded with confused stare. Tells me to try to submit again. Turnitin magically works this time. No points taken off. I didn't have to cheat for most of my finals as a senior. However, history has been a weak point at that time, because I had zero interest in it as a teenager. I was a technophile and worked 30+ hours a week while maintaining my regular class schedule. This afforded me some pretty cool stuff, like the very first CD burner in my town. I picked it up on a trip to Dallas. No electronics stores in my town, and very little online shopping could be conducted. It was $900 before tax. This was a major effort in the way of cheating, because audio mixing software was not common, and was prone to crashing if the file was too large. Internet was very slow, dial-up, which hindered efforts to figure out ways to do what I was trying to do, and burners often screwed up if you did something as simple as bumping the computer too hard while writing, and it would eat a $20 disk. Anyhow, for history our teacher offered one of two choices: A. Take the test. B. Rewrite the Bill of Rights in its entirety. This was way back when we were allowed to listen to music during tests. The teachers thought it helped reduce cheating because people would be listening to their music and not trying to help each other cheat / passing notes / whispering / etc. The days before the test I spent at my computer reciting the entire Bill of Rights from our textbook, down to quoting the correct punctuation. Once finally burned, the CD had 2 tracks. Track 1 was Fleetwood Mac. I had a thing for Stevie Nicks, Little Lies. Track 2 was my recording. I did this in case they wanted to make sure it wasn't a recording of the Bill of Rights. All sorts of weird shit could be bought on CD back in the day. No teacher would suspect I had a homemade CD, because no one in our town had ever even heard of a home use CD burner, and I kept mine super secret, because I didn't want a million people asking me to burn sheet for them, because it took forever to copy a single disk. If you opted for writing the Bill of Rights, every mistake was a point. I was 100% correct. My history teacher started asking if I had a photographic memory. On the very last day of school, usually a complete fuck-off day for most high schools, I handed him the disc I had made. Never really heard anything from him, but I would be willing to bet he never allowed any audio in his tests ever again. My Catholic school had a strict uniform policy that girls had to wear skirts with either grey socks or grey or black tights. They eventually had to specify they had to be solid color tights, not anything with any transparency. This was because girls used to write cheat sheets, tape them to their upper legs, so they'd be hidden by the skirt. Then they'd wear semi-transparent tights, the kind that look solid, but with a bit of stretching you can see through. During the exam they'd just pull their skirt over the knee a little. We had a school tie as part of the uniform, very cheaply made and easy to unpick. I'd seen one kid flip his tie over and uncut the back seam, then write answers and tips on material and sew it into the seam, leaving a little material to cover his cheat notes. Since he was naturally fidgety, his fumbling with his tie the whole exam seemed like he was just stressed out. One common one was buy standard transparent biro pens, scrawl notes on paper, put them inside the pen, around the inkwell. But as the paper is visible, it's risky. I had a friend get that acetate stuff for the old projectors, write notes on that, and slip that inside the pen. I work in education now, and I've seen a kid use an iPad Shuffle Touch and a rubber watch strap to make what looked like a fancy digital watch. We thought he was checking his watch a lot, but he'd found ways to put answers on there and check them during the exam. My school is pretty much planning to ban any watches from exam halls the same way we do any mobile phones or smartphones. We have busted kids for fairly complex Morse code, which was as impressive as it was disappointing. All that effort learning the codes could have been spent studying. I used to have my students read a novel on their own time, called it the independent reading assignment. A week before they needed to be finished, I'd give them a big document with a bunch of different essay prompts, enough so that they could select one that would work appropriately with their novel. I'd also let them bring in a sheet of notebook paper with quotes and textual evidence from the book to put in their essay as MLA and text citations. This was a pretty good system, and a lot of kids did very well. But there were always kids who'd bite off more than they can chew and pick tough classics that sounded cool, but were much more, let's say, boring than they initially thought. One student who had difficulty reading picked Dance Inferno, actually, the entire Divine Comedy. I suggested that the piece was tough and that he might look elsewhere. He understood my concern. I'm not a dick to my students, but chose to read the piece anyway. Test time comes around, and he turns in a 3-page essay that he wrote in around 30 minutes. This was absolutely stellar for him, and I was impressed until I got to reading it. The video game Dance Inferno had just been released, and he told that story, not the actual story from the poem. I was 23 at the time, and I've always loved video games, so I picked up on this fairly quickly. I pulled him in during my plan block and talked to him about it, even playing YouTube videos of the game to back myself up. He insisted that I was wrong and eventually stormed out in anger. His parents come to the school at the end of the day and beach me out, cover for their kid, insist that I'm a horrible teacher, etc. My principal and I have a good relationship, though, so he backed me 100% and the kid received a 0 on the assignment and had to write me a 3-page essay about the consequences of academic dishonesty. A year later, after he graduates, barely, he comes into my classroom and to visit. I'm teaching, but he promises to be quiet and just sit there. When the students eventually get to some independent work time, we talk and catch up. He's doing decently well, and I congratulate him. On his way out, he turns to my class and says, "I never read a book in this stupid class and Mr. Hemingway's Beard 42 is worthless." I just smiled and nodded, shut the door in his face, and turned back to my shocked class. I tell them not to worry about it, and that some people are just vindictive and can't take responsibility for their past actions. My students laugh it off and get back to work. I don't have a lot of discipline issues and I get high marks on my yearly evals, so I wasn't bothered. I found out a bit later that the kid got kicked out of EMT school for cheating. Some things never change. I worked as a teaching assistant for several years. Honestly, I suspect that most of the students I worked with were too dumb to cheat. They just failed to turn in homework assignments, fail the tests, and then whine at the teacher for make-up assignments at the end of the semester when they realized they'd have to go to summer school or not graduate on time. It drove me nuts, because my entire purpose for being there was to help out students who were struggling. Officially, I was assigned to work with special edition students in mainstream classrooms, but if I had the time, I was more than happy to help out anyone who was struggling. But my god, there were so many mainstream students who would have rather failed a class and have to take summer school than admit they needed help. And sure, there were more than a few of them that had impulse control issues, as teenagers often do, because they'd be chatting on their cell phones and not paying attention, and then at the end of the semester, they'd whine and cry about makeup work. I was never cruel enough to deny them that, as long as the teacher approved, but I never stopped thinking, holy shit, if you just did what you were supposed to when you were supposed to, you wouldn't be in this mess. I will never understand teens. Don't friggin' yell at me to leave you alone when you're not doing your work, and don't come crying to me for help when your failing grades have caught up with you. And I want to make it clear, I harbor no resentment against all high school students. I've worked with plenty who really were struggling and who appreciated my assistance. I mean hell, I will never forget the student I worked with daily who had a learning disability that prevented him from understanding basic algebra. But you know what? No matter how many times he failed, he kept trying, and I can respect that a million times more than some dipshit who clearly can do the work, but chooses not to. Not a teacher, but a worker at disability services on my college campus. No one will probably see this. I'm late to the party. I asked my boss what the worst case of cheating was, and she told me this. At disability services on campus we let tons of different people in, as long as they have documentation. ADHD, dyslexia, blindness, irritable bowel, etc. We always tell the students before their exams to empty their pockets. No notes, books, phones, wallets, keys, anything that'd be considered cheating. A professor one day asked my boss about a certain student. He was not active in class, rarely showed up, did poorly on homework, but excelled during the exams when he took them with our service. With suspicion, she would ask him if he had any of the things on him like mentioned above, and he said he didn't. They proctored him and watched his moves, nothing happening during the test. Something was still fishy, but they didn't know what. What they did find out was that he would always go to the restroom before the test, then several times during the test. This is nothing uncommon, for the student workers do not know what disability the other students have and have to let them use the restroom if they request to do so. They sealed the test and let him go. He gets a 97%. Professor is still pestering my boss and saying the office is letting him cheat, blah blah. Before the next test then, my boss waits for the student to go to the bathroom and then start taking the exam. She goes into the men's restroom and can't find anything in there until she looked into the toilet paper dispenser of the stall. He had crammed loads of notes in there and would then use the advantages of restroom breaks offered by us to cheat. She took the notes out, then he got a 71%, which the professor said was a little more accurate. You always see new ways to cheat in our office, especially during finals. I'm not a teacher. Here's my story. My school would send out progress reports periodically, not to be confused with report cards. The progress report grades were not permanent. The progress reports would list the students' current grades as of that day. My parents were aware of these reports and were always expecting them on progress report day. In junior high, I was far from the best student. I tried, but certainly could have studied more in some subjects. At report card time, it was usually C's and B's when I did get bad grades, even on progress reports. The punishment was usually a painfully long lecture on good grades, college, success, blah, 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 as well as a weekend grounded. I was in junior high in the mid-90s. Home PCs were still a new concept to most people. My folks had one, and a printer. That's all I needed. The progress reports were generated through the program that the faculty used to keep track of grades. I believe it was called Excelsior, or something like that. The reports were nothing more than a well-formatted Notepad document. Knowing this, I created a sort of Notepad template on the computer. This template was identical to the progress reports. So, before progress report day I would edit the template and guesstimate some legitimate grades for my classes. I would never put down anything extreme, like all A's. For example, if I was expecting a D, I would put down a C etc. Just enough to keep me out of lockdown. Then, when the teachers handed out the reports, I would determine if the actual report was okay, or if I needed to swap it out for one of my modified progress reports. If I needed to do so, I would hand that to my folks in its place. I would still get a lecture on studying harder, but I would have my weekends free, TV privileges, etc. Note that this did not work on report card day, different format, but it was a good failsafe in the event that I received a bad progress report. If I received a D or F on the legit progress report, I would show my folks the fake one, but then actually up my efforts and I would try to not get a low grade on my final report card. I did this throughout JH until the school switched programs and also started using watermarked stationery. Regardless, I actually did pull myself together in HS. Good grades, went to college, 2 degrees, successful, etc. TLDR, I printed fake progress reports to give to my parents. so I wouldn't be grounded. So I'm using a throwaway for obvious reasons. I'm very paranoid. In my freshman science class in high school, the teacher had these quizzes online that were multiple choice. His style was to make kids memorize stuff. Like you did the practice so much that you remembered it. I have a good memory. I just didn't do the practices. On the day of the test, I bring in my own computer, which was allowed, and I start the test. In another window, I had to Google the question and the exact Quizlet would show up that had the answers. Little did I know, the teacher at the desk like 3 meters behind me, not my science teacher, wasn't just there because it was her computer lab or something. I believe she was there to make sure little sheets like me didn't cheat. I googled another answer, and then the teacher behind walks up to my teacher and whispers something. I swear I was going to throw up when I see him subtly point at me at the corner of my eye and nod. He walks over and hits some commands on the keyboard to see how many applications were open. He just saw Chrome. He asks me, were you on any other sites? I shake my head and he sits back down. The scariest part is, just before opening the Chrome window and hiding it behind the test window, I was thinking about open the test in Chrome and the Google window in another browser. Had I faking made that decision, I would have been faked, oh royally faked. In fact, right after the test, I asked to go to the bathroom because I had already submitted the test, so there's no going back, and threw up. I have never been so nervous and scared at the same time. You know that amusement park ride where you're strapped in and you just free fall for like 3 seconds? And that feeling in your stomach? I'm having that feeling now just thinking about it. In fact, I feel like I have to throw up right now. I only googled about 7 answers out of about 60 questions. I got a 95. That experience has deterred me from cheating ever again. I'll take a B+ over getting caught. Junior in high school. So earlier this year, our US history teacher springs a surprise test on us for the end of the week, covering damn near 100 pages of material and several chapters. Of course, this was also the week that we had an overload of coursework in our other classes too, so we all did the best we can studying by ourselves, but it's so much that we put it off until Thursday. Some of my friends suggested collaborating on a study guide, and I suggested making a Google Doc and sharing it with them and a couple of my other friends, so probably 6 or 7 people. That was 6 p.m. and by 9:45 that night we had 40 students actively editing the study guide and highlighting what information we knew was going to be on the test. Earlier that week we were assigned to write test questions that our teacher would select to be on the test. It was fucking awesome to see so many honors students come together for the common good. The next day, everyone in the class had a copy of the study guide electronically or physically. Soon afterward I set up a community folder for the entire junior class to upload study guides, analyzes, etc. It's been such a big help prepping for tests, especially when it's a week when you have work or sports or just too much going on in your life in general to study on your own. Our class of 2016 folder is probably worth its size in metaphorical gold. Bitcoins perhaps. TLDR, I created a public Google Docs folder for my classmates and I to collaborate on a big test. Now we share everything on there. Okay, so this isn't cheating in any way, but I felt like it almost was. When I was a freshman at Austin, I had a chemistry professor who made a 500 question exam for the final. But what he told the class was that 90% of the exam would be made up of questions from other exams and quizzes. I figured he meant that 90% of the questions would be the same, but with different letters assigned to it, or the same question, but with different wrong option choices, etc. But to study, and I use that term loosely, I hacked a copy of Marvel Universe screensaver, so that for 3 weeks before the exam my computer would just cycle through all the test and quiz answers, and pictures of the Avengers, etc. But because I was lazy I just straight copied all the questions. So the day of the test rolls around, and I'm not remotely nervous or anything, because even without my study aid I only needed a C on the final to get an A in the course. He tells us to open the test booklet and begin, and I get about 5 questions in and I realize that my teacher is as lazy as I am because all of the answers are exactly like the previous tests/quizzes, so if it was A the first time, the answer is A on the final. I'm about 5 minutes into the test when I realize that I've answered about 6 or so questions of the 10% new material and that all of them have been answer C. I blew through the rest of the final and turned my Scantron and Blue Book in at about 10 minutes into the test. The teacher actually wouldn't let me leave for 5 minutes because we had a 15-minute policy where people could show up late up to 15 minutes, but that no one could be excused or leave to allow for that. So I sat there silently and the TA asked if I wanted to review my test, but I had actually managed to do that inside the 10 minutes it took me to do the test. So I said no and asked if I could break out my history textbook to study for that final instead, which was not as easy. And that was how I got a perfect 500 over 500 on my Chemical 301 final. A little late to the party, but wanted my story told how her 8th grade constitution was the class. The instructor was my wrestling coach, and I was one of his best wrestlers, so I'm not sure if the story is because of that or not, but my best friend was smart, like he didn't need to study, and got straight A smart. Well, his girlfriend sat right in front of me in class. My best friend would write the answers down on the corner of the test, multiple choice, A, B, C, D, and rip it off and throw it over to me. I would pick it up off the ground and correct any answers I may have gotten wrong, and then passed over up to his girlfriend. Passed every test with an A. One day we had a pop quiz and I wasn't prepared at all. I leaned over asking my friend what the answer to number 1 was, not thinking my teacher would hear, and all of a sudden my teacher started yelling at us saying no cheating, blah blah. He told my friend to move seats over to an empty row. He asked if anyone else wanted to move. I raised my hand thinking I'll move and pass this test and show him I could do this without cheating, so I went to the empty row. He made us sit in the first and last seat. As soon as I started taking the test I realized I wasn't going to answer as great as I thought, which meant a big fat F on the quiz. Once done my teacher said to pass the papers to the person behind you to grade them. So my friend and I switched papers, but we didn't, just made it look like we did. My teacher would sit in the back of the classroom and read the answers to us, so before he started, I was quickly erasing my answers. And when he gave the real answers I just wrote them in, and he would never know, because he was behind us. Also, my teacher called my friend out on his missing corners on his test, asked him why every test had missing corners. Without hesitation my friend ripped some paper from his notebook and shoved it in his mouth saying, "Since you don't let us chew gum in class, I chew some paper, it helps me think better." He was never questioned again about it, nor did we ever get caught after that. A few anecdotes. From both TAR and student perspective point, I was taking a first year university programming course, and I got very annoyed by how many of the students were blatantly submitting each other's code while changing nothing, or just adding white space. What annoyed me even more was that the prof never seemed to give any of them crap about it, as this was still happening in the final assignment point. My partner switched into Comp C for undergrad soon after we started dating. There were some assignments that I basically programmed myself, as I did always try to make sure they understood what my code was doing, at least point across a number of courses. I'd occasionally note that my test marks had been incorrectly totaled, so they were too high. Every single time I reported this, whichever prof it was usually laughed with surprise and always let me keep the higher mark point. I dropped a physics course 1 year after the first assignment and a midterm, as I was far too overloaded and would failed. Seriously, this was the third of 4 back-to-back 90-minute classes. I vastly overestimated my capabilities that year. Come the next year, when I'm trying again, I realize the prof is using the exact same assignments and midterms as before, and I still have my material from the aborted attempt copied over the answer for one of the stupidly time-consuming assignment questions, and used the other old answers to check my new ones. In doing so, I realized the marker on the old answers had missed that I'd made 2 mistakes that cancelled each other out on the first question. Also basically memorized the answers for the first midterm and aced it. I think point not very good examples, I guess, as I'm honest to a fault. I felt like sharing, though. A kid waited until someone else turned in their answer sheet then acted like was going to turn in his. He put his on the stack, pointed out that he forgot to put his name on it, then picked it up along with the previous person's, and went and changed all his answers to match. It was pretty obvious, but I'll let it play out, to avoid making a scene, while others are still testing. I'll just talk to him about it later. A lot of kids try to cheat, so I had 4 different versions of the test out there with the questions and answer choices in different orders. Most kids knew this, and it helped deter some cheaters, catching others. Anyway, I look at the hurriedly erased answers on his sheet and he would have had a C on it. The stuff he copied got him an F though. To his credit, he only tried asking for the grade he would have had once, then admitted he faked up and deserved the worst grade point. I'll let anyone that failed or was caught cheating, normally an automatic 50, since that was the lowest grade the principal allowed us to give, retake tests after school for up to a 70, though I don't think he did point at it. It was a last stop charter I worked at. The kind that had gang unit officers in the hall at all times instead of a typical police liaison. I covered maps on the walls during geography tests. One kid just got up, walked to the map, and tried to peek behind the cover. No trying to be stealthy, just walked across the room to check. I warned him. He pulled the same thing soon after, so I took his test for cheating. The kid got in my face after class, and in his best attempt to be intimidating poked me with a finger, and said he didn't like me in a sort of stern, growly way. Well, another kid that was higher ranking in their gang and built like a gorilla saw it and did like me, so he chucked the cheating kid into a wall and gave him a talking to for me. That was satisfying. I work at an urban public high school in a district that offers access to an online credit recovery system. For some students, they can work a regular hour in the computer lab into their schedules, and then one certified teacher just sits there and resets the tests in the online system. The kids can fail each one up to 3 times before needing the teacher to reset the test until the kids pass the courses they need to graduate. Other students, whose schedules are too full, or who may be on homebound learning for some reason, are expected to access the system from at home. One student, in particular, was supposed to be finishing her courses through home access to the credit recovery system, simply because her attendance was abysmal, and we couldn't get her in the building every day, as near as I can figure. She had an individualized educational plan, IEP, for emotional impairment, so when she did come in, she usually wanted to meet with her caseload worker and talk rather than go to classes anyway. So, on this fateful day, in comes our illustrious student. She stops in the resource room to talk with her caseload worker, who naturally asks how the online courses are going. The girl can't remember what lesson/test/section she is on, and the caseload worker, innocently hoping to find out how close the girl was to completing the courses and therefore earning her diploma, asked another teacher in the department to look up her scores while they talked. The caseload worker had a busy day, so this meant she was dragging the girl with her around the building so they could fit their chat in, while the caseload worker still got work done, dropping off paperwork, etc. The girl was probably in the building for an hour or more. In the meantime, her online class was steadily progressing. One test after another was being completed at the same time. The girl was clearly not sitting at a computer working on her class. She didn't have her cell phone out, or even with her, either. The caseload worker and the teacher in the department ended up confronting the girl, who readily admitted her mom was doing the online class work for her. Because they couldn't prove that the student had done any of the work, she lost credit for that course, and likely a few others she was simultaneously signed up to complete. Sure, online courses are not necessarily the utmost in secure testing to begin with, but you would think at least the girl and her mom would have been more careful with this scheme. This girl at my school knew she was going to bomb a Scantron exam and had read about some lip gloss trick online. Basically, to my understanding, the idea is something like this. You put lip gloss or chapstick or a similar clear product down the side of the Scantron, and then, when the Scantron goes to mark answers wrong with the little pink lines, they don't stick. so the machine can't read how many lines there are at the end, and thus gives you a perfect score. I don't know if I got all the technical aspects of it right, but it doesn't matter, because it's just a rumor that doesn't work, and that was her explanation of it. Aside from it just plain not working, 2 other stupidities attributed to her downfall. The problem is she used thick lip gloss with little red flakes of glitter in it, so although the tar didn't notice it when running the Scantron, the teacher caught it immediately, and she didn't answer half the questions on the test, so he noticed that immediately as well. He was a bit pissed off, but he thought it was more funny than anything, failed her on the test, and shared the story with us, and showed us the Snopes.com article explaining how it doesn't work, so we don't try it. Goddamn though, that girl was dumb as shit. She thought Alaska was its own country, thought dinosaurs went extinct 18,000 years ago, thought salt water was salty from people being sweaty at the beach, didn't know the moon didn't make its own light, didn't know multiplication. Basically it was a miracle that she got through elementary school. But it didn't matter, since her family was ungodly rich, and she was attractive. So she flunked, but somehow passed all her high school classes, totaling 2 new Porsches and a new BMW in the process, and now has been just traveling/living around the Mediterranean for the past 3 or 4 years. I always think of her story when I need to remind myself that life isn't fair. When I taught technically TAD 4, an intro to play analysis class, one of my students copy and pasted huge sections from 3 or 4 different sources into a montage of an essay to the extent that there was not one original sentence. As I read the first page, I thought, wow, good for this student, she took my advice to get some help from the writing lab on campus. As I kept reading it, it became more and more obvious that she didn't write the paper, and some assistance from my research assistant, Dr. Google, proved that fact. What was really unfortunate for her was that one of the essays she copied from extensively was an essay I had studied in preparation for the course point in a separate class I TAD for. One undergraduate's first paper was basically a graduate level paper, and I was excited to have a student who could articulate her thoughts so well. I even wrote her an email to compliment her on one line she wrote. However, when I compared that paper to the timed, in-class, essay-style midterm, the writing style seemed to indicate that it couldn't have been the same person that wrote both. The professor and I eventually turned the case over to the academic integrity department, and the student's defense was that she had just had a very good editor, and she provided copies of her rough drafts with extensive handwritten notes with ways to improve the paper. The professor and I were kind of amazed, and we're interested in how academic integrity will handle the issue. The papers appear to be original thought. She went through the process we recommend students with difficulty writing take, finding an editor, but the paper seems to rely too much on the editor's comments. I'm still not sure what to think. Student in a calculus exam in college was cheating by having a scrap of paper with notes on it and would cover it up with his test paper when he thought I wasn't looking. I noticed almost first thing when the test started, so I thought I'd let him go for a while and let him get his defenses down. Sure enough, about 10 minutes in, he was trying a lot less hard to cover the paper up. I walked over to his desk, reached under the test, and drew out the scrap, and asked him to sign, and ate the scrap paper. Important little bit of protocol here, teachers, hand in his test and leave. That in itself isn't the dumbest thing I've seen. What happened next is he turned to me as I was escorting him out of the room, and begged me not to turn him in. I told him I had no choice. College policy mandates that I report all instances of academic dishonesty, which was true. So he left. Still not the dumbest thing ever. But then, a day later, he sent me an email saying that he actually wasn't cheating on the test, the paper was for some other class, and that he was going to go talk to the dean of students to make sure he didn't get in trouble. So naturally I walked up to the dean's office, same building as mine, and showed him the paper with the student's name and date on it, and explained the situation. The student did claim to the dean that he wasn't cheating. The dean then charged him with a second breach of academic dishonesty for lying about having not cheated. The kicker was that our college had a 2 strikes policy, 1 breach of academic dishonesty and you're on record, 2 strikes and you are expelled. so the poor kid went from 0 to being in position for expulsion on the same test. Eventually he received some mercy from higher administration and was allowed to stay in school, but then he dropped out the following semester. My takeaways: 1. It's really stupid to try to cheat in college, and 2. If you do cheat and get caught, own it, don't try to weasel out of it. It only makes it worse. TLDR college calculus student cheats on a test, gets caught, begs for mercy, then changes his mind and says he wasn't cheating, gets charged with second academic dishonesty charge for lying, nearly gets expelled. I witnessed this scenario unfold while I was taking an intro-level chemistry lab. Student A tells his friend, Student B, who is in the same class, that he is having trouble writing his lab report, and asks Student B if he can borrow his to get an idea of correct formatting / content / etc. Student B gives Student A his lab report to use as an example. Student A copies the lab report word for word and tries to pass it off as his own. And here's the kicker. Student A goes to the professor with the stolen lab report, claims that they were the true author, and tells the professor that Student B asked to see their report, so if the professor noticed any similarities it was because Student B had copied them from Student A. However, Student A didn't know that Student B's lab session was a weekend, meaning that Student B had completed his lab report and turned it in before Student A had even done the corresponding lab, which meant that there was no way in hell that Student A was telling the truth. I think Student A got a 0 on the report and barely pulled a D out of the class. The professor chose not to report him to the dean for academic dishonesty because it probably would have resulted in his expulsion, and the professor's attitude was that everyone makes stupid decisions in their life and that they should have the chance to realize what they did was wrong and change their behavior. He did tell the student that if anything like this ever happened again, their ass would be out on the street. When I was in high school, kids would keep a post-it with formulas or whatever stuck to the inside over their sliding calculator cover, which slid into the back of the calculator when in use, so they could just slide the cover off a bit and reference the post-it pretty secretly. Urban legend has it, no one I know, just something I saw online that I thought was smart, that kids would print fake water bottle labels with answers on the inside surface, or B, print entirely fake slipcovers for soft drink cans with answers / etc printed in the fine print. I'm not sure who was allowed to have beverages during school tests though. By college or postgrad, I think we were allowed to bring a drink though. It's been a while. Perhaps the most clever, a law school friend of mine told this one to me after I had already graduated, so it didn't help me. He claimed never to have used it, and I believe him, given that cheating in this way would likely have resulted in expulsion, but to have come up with the idea. We could write our exams on our own laptops using a particular software that locks out the laptop entirely other than the software during the exam period, so you can't reference the web, notes in Word or any other software or documents. He matter-of-factly suggested one day that all one would need to do would be to have installed that software inside an emulator shell, and one ought to be able to open software alongside the emulator, even though the emulator would be locked out. We'll never know if the software makers somehow anticipated and were able to protect against this, as it was, supposedly, never actually used. I had a student last year that was the unfortunate victim of a farming accident, live outside Indianapolis and it's a large farming community. When he was young he was helping his brother with corn and using a combine and somehow got his hand stuck. Now his nickname is Stumpy. How he introduced himself: well, Stumpy has a fake hand that's pretty neat. It attaches and is latched on at the wrist with some old-fashioned leather, and it looks pretty awesome. He said he'd rather have that than, and I quote, some newfangled contraption that will make me a robot. No big deal. Last May rolls around, and we are testing right before finals, and I notice he keeps playing with his hand. I walk over and notice something sticking out of the palm of his hand and ask in jest if he needs a hand. He got all gruff, and I thought maybe I made an insensitive joke, but then realized the part of the lashing that either was coming off was in fact a piece of paper. I asked what it was, and he kind of looked down. We went out into the hallway and I asked him again what the paper was. He pulled it out, and it was a sheet rolled up in a little scroll with a whole bunch of information on it. I team teach, so the teacher that's officially in charge of the class usually does his tests in chronological order as far as questions go. Things you learned early in the front, newest stuff in the back. I had to hand it to him, it was quite the ruse. Not a professor or teacher, but friends of mine did this to pass a computer, hardware, programming class. This was back in 2000, when very basic LAN setup in college computer labs was quite common. Test taker would enter the computer lab and draw a practical assignment test from a bowl. They were labeled A1 to A10 and B1 to B10. This was the assigned computer terminal, and the program the test taker had to complete was written on a paper turned upside down. At this point, the test taker would know exactly the assignment he would have to complete. Each batch of 20 testers got one random program out of the 25 programs taught that semester. Allotted time to complete the assignment was 2 hours. Here's where the trick comes in. The student would log on to their terminal and pretend to type code for about 30 to 45 minutes. At that time, they would ask for a bathroom break. Now, since the teacher suspected students were up to something sneaky, they would have an assistant escort the test taker to the common bathroom. What they didn't know was an accomplice would walk into the bathroom while the escort waited outside. Pretending to pee, the student would tell his accomplice what assignment he got and go back to the computer test lab. Over the next 10 minutes, the accomplice would go to a different computer lab and upload the program into a predetermined folder on LAN starting with a special character. This prevented it from showing up in DOS search. Now the student would access the folder known to him and download the program onto his terminal. The accomplice would delete the hidden folder to erase traces and go about his own way. The student would add comments and pretty up the output of the program, compile and demo it, thus passing the exam. The two would switch roles, and the accomplice, who was in a different batch, since batches were limited to 20 students, would pass using the same technique. The teachers never caught on. I graduated and didn't know how long this went on. Edits, grammar, clarification, cleanup, etc. As part of a stats exam in college, we had to use blue books for a word problem or something. The rest was multiple choice. We also had to show our work in the blue book. There were a ton of formulas to memorize, and I was choking badly. I knew how to use the formulas, but would crack under pressure and forget them a little, which would throw off answers, or forget the formulas altogether. So I wrote the formulas down in the blue book, first in a page reasoning. If I were questioned later, I'd claim to have written down the formulas at the very beginning of the exam to ensure I wouldn't forget in formulas. I was never questioned about it. I did the same thing in law school with outlines. I'd bring in my own blue book with the outline on the front page or two. In law school, we'd have a proctor hand us blue books if we chose to take the handwritten exam. You could take the laptop exam. I insisted on the handwritten along with maybe 10 other students, which meant prep. In advance, I'd go to the room where the exam was to take place and stick the outline blue book underneath the tabletop where I planned to sit. I used gummy stickum that wouldn't tear the blue book cover when removing. I also put double-sided tape under the table where I'd sit. More on this later. I used paper clips to keep the blue book closed while suspended under the table. Next was making sure I'd get that seat. Seating was not pre-arranged, so I'd always get the seat. A seat on the end. You're unlikely to be shuffled by the proctor if you're seated at the end. Once I even came in on crutches to ensure against being moved. That was a Civ Pro exam that I knew I'd fail without the cheat. All the rules on civil procedure? Hell no, I didn't know them. Then, as the exam was coming to a close and students were taking their materials up to the proctor, and with the proctor's attention elsewhere, and after I'd used my cheat, I'd put the doctored blue book back under the table with the double stick tape. The gummy stuff held for maybe a half hour. The double-sided tape lasted longer. I'd then submit my exam and wait for the classroom to completely empty and retrieve my doctored blue book to avoid later discovery. I won't get into the bar exam. I'm an economics professor and was giving a final exam and allowed the students to use one sheet of paper with notes as a cheat sheet. It had been a hellish quarter and I decided to give them a break. Final exam day comes and I see 90% of the class hovered around a student seated in the back and see money going back and forth. I stroll on over and ask them what is going on, and they told me honestly that they knew the student was smart, so the student agreed to sell copies of his note sheet for $10 each. I couldn't get mad. It was entrepreneurship at its best. I walked back to the front and waited a few minutes until everyone was seated and asked for a show of hands of all the students who bought a note sheet. I told them they were not in trouble, but I was just curious as to how many students participated. 40 students raised their hands. I asked them if they looked over the note sheet before they bought it, because it could be filled with crap. One student said he wears glasses and looks smart, so I figured I wouldn't have to study and still pass the test with his notes. It honestly took me 30 minutes to get them to understand that they only put the value of their final grade at $10. I told them to look at the student counting his $400 he just made, and that he probably learned more than they all did combined just by making a note sheet. He must have retained some of the information and had an edge on all of them. I even tried to use supply and demand to explain how the student got their money, and they didn't even get the relationship. Sigh. Sadly only 10 out of the 40 passed the test, and I had them all again in class the next quarter. Damn it, I'm late, but during my middle school honors class, everyone cheated off everyone. Here's what we did. The room was broken up into sections, so every group of 6 to 7 people assigned a vocalist. If someone in the group had a question, you would swipe your finger on the desk just loud enough for your group to hear and no one else. The question would be answered with the appropriate sniffle if someone knew the answer. If no one in the group knew what the answer was, the vocalist would sneeze, cough, or blow their nose the appropriate amount. A vocalist from the other side of the class would yawn or cough in return with the answer. Every vocalist had either asthma or allergies, so no suspicions were aroused. Keep in mind this was also an honors class, so most questions were answered in the group and the vocalists were used under 10 times a test normally point. If by chance the vocalist had a real cough or sneeze, a group member would say bless you or excuse you immediately to let the other groups know it was genuine. Point. We had a freak out once because some kid farted and we didn't know what it meant. I figured the kid really just accidentally farted, but the other vocalists looked so confused and worried. Our middle school honors. Just a bunch of ants marching really. Point. We also almost got caught when some kid named Austin threatened to expose the class. He was being a genuine dick, so the class kinda didn't help him for a few weeks. He also snitched on a kid for saying the word vagina. Dude raised his hand and was like, Mr. Kincaid Allen's talking about private parts. Fuck you, Austin. Don't know how stupid this is compared to others. I was more amazed at the audacity of it. Point. I'm an English teacher. Half of my classes are honors seniors, and I have very high expectations of them. I also absolutely abhor cheating of any kind, including plagiarism. Point. The student's assignment was to translate passages from Macbeth from Old English to modern. This was to make sure they understood the diction, because if you don't understand Shakespeare's diction, you can't understand the plot. Point. Well, I'm checking the students' work and find that 4 students in one class shamelessly copied their translations from No Fear Shakespeare's website. NFS has modern text of every major Shakespeare work. Problem is, their modern texts are often very poorly translated. I can spot NFS from a mile away. Point. So I'm pissed off about it and follow school policy by giving them all zeros and informing the dean of discipline. The day after grades are posted, one of the students stomps up to my desk and snaps, I don't know who the hell you think you are, but I don't cheat, and I want you to change my grade back right now. I'm not stupid enough to screw myself in my senior year of high school. First of all, I said, your attitude and tone right now are completely inappropriate. Second of all, if you want to get yourself in further trouble by continuing to be a liar, I suppose that's your prerogative, but I have this thing where I don't like people to waste my time. So why don't you go sit down, and while you do your work today, I'm going to sit here and highlight every word you plagiarized off NFS, and after I'm done, we can decide together whether you cheated or not. There were literally 10 words out of 400 that weren't copied. So I called her back up and showed her the veritable ocean of neon yellow on her paper, and I said, now, would you like to look me in the eye and tell me you didn't plagiarize now? TLDR. Student thinks she's smarter than me. Student is wrong. I'm currently an engineering student and my dad was a finance professor, so I've got tons of stories to tell, even though this will probably be buried. One time my dad was giving a final. He only taught grad students, so the program was pretty competitive and the students were pretty honest. During the test, a kid, we will call him Mark, came up and said that he really needed to use the bathroom. They had been taking the exam for about 2 hours, and my dad was always a really trusting guy, so he said he could go. A few minutes later, a girl came up and handed my dad a slip of paper that she had torn off of her exam that said Mark has a sheet of paper in his pocket that has equations and solutions on it. Now, keep in mind that this was about 20 years ago. My dad thought about what to do for a bit and finally got up, leaving his task to proctor the exam as he followed Mark to the bathroom. He opened the bathroom door and peeked under the stalls looking for Mark's feet. Once he found them, the bathroom was empty besides Mark. My dad cupped his hands around his eye and, I kid you not, peered through the crack in the bathroom stall to see Mark sitting on the toilet with the seat down reading a piece of paper. My dad bellowed, "Mark, you give me that sheet of paper this second." And when retelling the story for years to come he would swear that Mark pissed himself. Point: as a college student in really large classes now, I've seen almost everything. Programming calculators, reading each other's exams. In one of my classes, the exam is open textbook. Most people have the ebook, so he allows us to bring tablets/laptops. A couple of kids in the class got the solution manual and would find each problem. They were all taken from the book and just copy the solution. Oh boy. Multiple stories here. Point: when I was in high school, we used to have tests every week on whatever material was covered the previous week. As expected, some people wouldn't bother to study because they couldn't care less. Cheating was rampant, and while the standard method would be to rip off the answers from the smart guy in class, there were a few people who managed to prepare small chits with formulae and notes to cheat from. This one guy decided that chits and asking someone else were too risky and unreliable, so he snuck in the textbook during one of the tests. Spent an abnormal amount of time looking between his legs to find the answers in the book and ace the test. He did this during multiple tests, somehow managing to get decent scores. Everything went wrong during a certain subject text. It was quite apparent that he had never used the textbook before in his life. All of us around him could hear the constant page turning as he was trying to find the corresponding information. Teacher was oblivious and this continued until time was up. She collected all the answer sheets and was about to leave the class. Our man had yet to submit his sheet as he was still trying to find the last few answers. As the teacher is leaving, he gets up and runs behind her with his answer sheet and the frickin' textbook in hand. Needless to say, he got caught. Point: I TA'd for a graduate level math course last semester. It was quite apparent that some students had the answer keys to the homework assignments from the previous years with them. The professor made sure that the exams were brand new and tested the subject material, but he was fairly lazy with the assignments. He reused last year's material and some of the students had a time of their life copying the answers from the answer key. Having spent a lot of time grading the papers and looking at the answer key, the other TAs, and I had developed a sense of intuition to gauge if someone had cheated. One particular student went out of their way to blatantly copy the answer key for one assignment, going as far as to copy the additional information section for a particular question word by word. We handed over the paper to the professor, and he had a small talk with the student who apologized and said it was because of lack of time. All well till next week's assignment. We took a look at that student's assignment to find that she copied the answer key once again, only changing alpha to beta throughout the assignment, hoping that we wouldn't catch her. Professor wasn't happy and decided to decrease the weightage of the HW as a result. I was a tar at one point, not an actual teacher, but still, I just have to share this piece of gold. Point: I went to a private high school that featured a really idiotic thing called Travel Week, where students could pay a ridiculously large amount of money to travel to foreign countries for a week on a field trip-esque thing. It happened in between semesters. If you didn't want to travel, most likely because you could not afford to, then you could stay at home instead, but you have to work on something. It could be literally anything, and then when you get back, you'd have to turn in either an essay about what you did, or a scrapbook on what you did. It was a pass/fail grade that went on your report card, but no one really gave a crap about it. If you chose to travel, you'd just be graded on participation there, I think. Note what I just said. No one gave a crap about it. Of all the things to cheat on, this is probably the dumbest thing you could possibly do. When I was tasked with grading these things, I was literally told to give everyone a passing grade, just for turning something in. There was literally no way that you could possibly fail. Unless you happened to be one of the 2 students that did the following thing. They decided during travel week to not travel, and instead stay at home. Kinda. In actuality, they wanted to take a personal trip to Hawaii, and then write about what they did there. Okay, fair enough. But guess what? They both turned in what was literally just a copy-pasted Wikipedia article for Hawaii. Never mind the fact that this tells me nothing about their personal experiences there or anything, which is what it was really about. But wait, it gets better. Not only did they turn in the same paper, but they even put the same name on the paper, and then one of the papers had a name crossed out by hand, and then handwritten another name there. All of this on an assignment that was impossible to fail. So the teacher called them into the office and had the following exchange. Teacher: so, you went to Hawaii, students? Yeah. Teacher: and how did you get there? Did you take a plane? Or, students: yeah, that's it. We took a plane. Teacher: excellent. Can I see your airline tickets? Students: oh, we threw them away. Teacher: ah, well, luckily, the airports save records of all the tickets they sell, so we'll just call them up and ask them. Okay. Note, this sounds kinda illegal, so I doubt that this is true, but it is what she said. Students: oh, we didn't really go to Hawaii. Teacher: total sarcasm. Really? I am shocked. These 2 students became the only students I ever knew to fail that assignment. And they were incredibly stupid about how they did it too. Not a teacher, or a student for that matter, TLDR at the bottom. However, my supervisor is a theater professor at a local university and he will require his students to see our shows, either for extra credit, or it pertains to a quiz or something coming up. Generally, for me, this means having to sign a plethora of tickets and/or programs after the show as proof they came and saw the whole thing. A lot of them will come last minute on the final weekend of shows. Is understandable. I've been there. A few stories that stand out though. One guy wanted me to sign his ticket 15 minutes before the show was over. Long story short, no, I cannot sign anything before the end of the show, because that means you didn't see it all. One girl was late to show to begin with, but before I took her inside she asked if she could make a quick phone call. 20 minutes later, she's still on the phone trying to coordinate with whoever. 45 minutes into the show and she finally goes in. This part of the rant is mostly fueled by the fact that to understand the type of show we were doing, you really need to see the beginning for context. When we reached intermission, she made a beeline for the parking lot and left, without her signed proof. The one that takes the cake though, this guy was late, but apparently didn't have time or interest to see the show at all, and it was a popular musical. He came to my friend in the box office and asked her to print off the ticket and get whoever, me, to sign it. She started laughing in his face because I was standing over her shoulder and watched it all go down. We both refused to help him out. TLDR, I get that, as an artist, my work is frequently undervalued. I also get that making time for required events is hard, and the fact that they are required gives you sound reason to resent it. But please, if you're in my place of work, respect me and what I do. I'm not asking for much, and you might enjoy it. I remember cheating in a group project with some friends. The course was about linear programming, and we were asked to use linear programming to solve Sudokus. Simple Sudoku solvers are really something trivial, but they don't use linear programming, so we had some work to do. After thinking about how to do it, writing down a fair amount of math, and coming up with something that made sense, we started coding. And because we were faking dumb, we started writing everything down in a programming language that doesn't have a great library to do linear programming with. After writing the rest of the code, we spent a lot of time trying to install and debug out-of-date libraries, kept failing, tried to just translate the code of a linear programming solver into our programming language, but it was really tough to read, and we didn't have much time. So when we tested our translation and it failed, we decided to just cheat. We found the shortest Sudoku solver in our programming language, which only took like 12 relatively obscure lines of code. We kept everything we had written before, which didn't work, and added the solver below it. We made the code look like it used what we had written before, while in fact it ignored all of it, and just used the copy-pasted solver, which didn't use linear programming. We showed the code to our professor, explained the math, explained the structure of the code quickly, and demonstrated the program. We got a pretty good grade. I don't feel too bad about this one though. We had worked hard, and we still haven't figured out whether our method would have produced a program that could solve Sudokus relatively fast if we had finished it without cheating, but we definitely worked harder for this project than what was expected for this course. Not a teacher, but when I was 17 I transferred high schools and wanted to be in the gifted program at this new school. At the time you had to take an IQ test and had to score a 135. The test was administered individually, just me and the proctor asking questions. Each question was graded 1 to 5, with a 1 being the worst score and a 5 being the best. This left some wiggle for the proctor to allow subjectivity in her evaluation. If you took a long time to come to the answer, for example, you might get a lower score. The test was divided into 6 or so sections. I did fine on a couple of sections, then clearly bombed one section. In the next section you had to put cards in order of how the story made logical sense. The proctor would then look at the back of the cards on which letters were printed and see if it spelled a word. For example, the story cards were such that you could interchange the S's or the E's and the story would still make sense, or E's could have been Seer and still have been correct. Luckily for me, she had to pee and left the room. I grabbed every card and memorized the letters and what the pictures corresponded to. I don't know how I did that so fast, because there were like 6 or 8 sets of cards remaining. When she came back everything was still in order. I subtly did well on all the remaining cards, including some intentional mistakes, but nothing catastrophic. I straight up cheated on my IQ test, scored a 138, and have never regretted it for a second. I have wondered, however, if that was part of the test. TLDR, literally looked at the answer for an IQ test when the proctor left the room. Edit, wasn't a teacher. Have been since. Am no longer. I've told this one before, but it's still the best I've seen. Last spring I was taught for a Roman history / classical reception class of a couple hundred students that met in a large auditorium. During the final exam our professor caught wind of a student trying to cheat in a particularly cockamamie way. He waited until about halfway through the 2-hour period when a sizable group of students finished their tests and walked out with them, taking the exam with him, but leaving the rest of his stuff at his seat. Apparently, his plan was to go somewhere, probably a bathroom stall, whatever, look up the answers to the questions on his phone, and fill out the exam. He would then return to the classroom to collect his forgotten backpack and covertly drop the completed test on the floor underneath his seat, counting on either another student or a janitor to find the test and turn it in. Admittedly, a gutsy plan, but totally convoluted. The professor was on to him, however, because he had tried a dry run of it during a quiz a few weeks beforehand. When he left the room she went up to his chair and brought his stuff down to the front of the room where we were. When the guy came back in about 45 minutes later he went to where he had left his backpack and found that it wasn't there. He did a classic double take and started to search the surrounding seats in the row and the rows of seats in front and behind. When he finally looked down to the front of the room, beckoned him down and gave him the 3rd degree. To his credit, the dude really tried to sell it and vehemently protested his innocence. All for naught. Alas, the best part was when the professor told the kid, who was a track athlete on scholarship, "This is a basketball school. You're nowhere near high enough on the athletics food chain to get away with that." Totally got this one. I assigned a simple hangman project for an entry-level computer science class, which is pretty standard. Great practice for arrays and loops. My coworker was grading and said that one of the student submissions looked really familiar, so he showed it to me. It sure did. But it also looked like some parts were computer generated, like very generic names like flag. The names make me think the compiler, and lo and behold, it was. Of our example program we showed when we assigned the project, that was a good laugh by itself, but the student didn't seem like the type to find, figure out, and use a decompiler. He had troubles doing the basics. We continued grading and find a project that is eerily similar to the first. Now it's not just plagiarism of our code, but now another student too. We end up talking to each student, of course. The first guy readily admits he was cheated, but didn't say how. He didn't know what a decompiler was. The second student had the smarts to do the project and to decompile, but held his ground that he simply sought help through normal googling, but we had already checked for that possibility. Students do that all the time. It took a while, but he finally admitted not only did he decompile, but he gave the code to the first student that raised the flags in the first place. He felt pretty bad about it and started to crumble once he finally fessed up. TLDR, student decompiled my code and turned it in as his own. I mostly work with ESL students, but also push into an ELA class once a day. The ESL students mostly just talk during a quiz. During tests, not so much. I think the most foolish instance was when I caught a student using her phone to check her spelling. We don't grade based on spelling, so long as we can understand what the word was intended to mean, so that was just pretty stupid of her, but she was always worrying about how to spell things. I like that, but not for the test point. Another instance of cheating was in the ELA class. For some quizzes we would have students swap papers and grade each other as we went over the answers as a class. Afterwards they could briefly give the quiz back to the person who took it, so they could see how they did. So these two students who had swapped with each other didn't mark each other's tests wrong, but hadn't changed the answers either. They were going to change themselves when they got them back, before turning them in. I noticed this and just collected the quizzes right away, so they wouldn't have time to do this. One refused, making up some lame excuse, like I need to rewrite my name and the date at the top. Fine. I stood over him, and when he didn't do that, I asked if he was done. Seeing that I wasn't going to leave, he finally handed it in. Didn't matter in the end, because he moved back to Georgia, the country, a month or two later, and I don't think his transcript came with him. I went to a public math and science magnet school in Los Angeles with really small graduating class sizes. They had us on block scheduling, so you'd spend 100 minutes in periods 1, 3, 5, and 7 Monwed, and 2, 4, 6, and 8 2/3. Friday was crunched up. The teachers rarely had more than 2 versions of any given test, and all students were taught the same level of the same subject in the same grade. This meant that, on weeks when there were quizzes or tests, a given teacher would give the same tests to period after period, then, the next day, give those same tests again to 3 or 4 more periods. The kids at this school were pretty wicked smart, and, like most smart kids, lazy as fuck. The graduating class ahead of mine became notorious for cheating, and it took a year and a half for the school to figure out how they were doing it. This was between 00 and 04, mind you, so smartphones were a rare luxury item. The evidence was all there. The first period of students to take any test scored just about fairly, but on every subsequent period that day, the average scores would go up. By the second day of testing, damn near every exam was near 100%. It didn't matter if they were multi-choice tests, or essay questions, or fill in the blanks either. What it turned out that they were doing was essentially using their smart kid memory powers and crowdsourcing answers. In the mere 10 minutes of passing time between periods, the class that had just taken the test would inform the incoming class to the best of their ability what content the test had covered, and discuss what the best answers were. Subsequent iterations that day had greater efficiency, as more bright little minds had had time to add to the information they were given. Then, that night, they'd all go home and instant message each other everything they remembered. They could pretty reliably construct the entire test from memory, and, typically, different versions of the test were simply the same test with the questions in a different order. By the time the evening was over, something like 80% of the graduating class knew the overwhelming majority of the best answers to the questions on the test. The administration, once they worked out how the students had been doing it, were actually not sure how to react. If the tested material was actually what was important about the course, and the students were using group work, a major emphasis at the school, to ensure that everyone demonstrated knowledge of that material, wasn't that actually what they were hoping for in the first place. It all wound up boiling over when some of the better hackers at the school got the better of the pretty incompetent sysadmins. Measures against them. Admittedly, it's tough to stop someone who knows what they're doing from gaining some degree of control over your network when they have hardware access to it. Basically, the class wound up stealing drafts of the exams from the teachers' work computers as much as a week ahead of time, then developing complicated systems to ensure that the resulting high test scores across all classes still exhibited the same rising pattern over the course of the day and into the next day, in an attempt to make it appear they'd simply gotten more efficient at transmitting the material class to class. This was a school that tried to keep up some pretense of prestige, so when this massive scheme was discovered, they actually couldn't really do anything about it. They had a couple slaps on the wrist for key players, but they basically would have had to have expelled over half the graduating class if they'd followed cheating policies to the letter. A bunch of fun things were revoked for that class, and they all graduated and went off to Ivy League schools and UCs the next year. Throwaway because I did this, and just in case point, back in high school I was always trying to find ways to make some extra money. One day I was speaking with a friend, let's call him Jim, and we came up with the idea to use my tech skills to cheat on tests and charge students. How we did this was pretty simple really. We used the money we had and bought some spy gadgets off of eBay. The main units were a wireless button camera to transmit video back to us, and a small earpiece that was pretty hard to see if you were wearing it. The earpiece connected over Bluetooth to the person's phone and they would call us before going into the room. Teachers at our school didn't check if the phone was off, only would fail you if they heard it ring. Basically we began by selling this for around $20-30 per person and kept it pretty anonymous by spreading it via rumors. People would hear about and were told to visit a website I set up. The website needed a password and once logged in you could submit your request. We had a system in place where we would drop the gear at the person's locker and they would leave the money in an envelope taped to the locker door. This worked well, and within a few days we had around 5 people wanting our help. We proceeded to help them and continued this for a few semesters. After a while the teachers finally caught on and started checking every electronic that entered the room before an exam or test. Was that the end? Nope. We had to change our methods. Our next method was these cool note watch you can buy on eBay. It basically stores notes in TXT format and allows you to quickly hide them by hitting a button which makes it look like a normal watch again. This worked and we sold them for around $150 a pop. The watches only cost $80, so decent profit for us. Sadly it all came crashing down. One day somehow a teacher got hold of the password to the site. Not hard because it hadn't changed over the course of a couple years, but this was the first time it happened. A fake. They posed as a student, filled out the form, and when my friend went to make the drop they busted him. He was expelled in his senior year because of it, and was only allowed to finish the last 4 weeks of grade 12 via distance ed. I don't remember exactly what this program is called. It's for kids that don't learn well at school or need more supervision. When I found out I shut the site down immediately, and he never ratted me out, thankfully, but I was scared shitless my last 4 weeks of high school. I wish I still had the gear so I could prove this story is true, but it really is, and it was tons of fun until we got caught. I did this in high school. I think it was for grade 11 US history. We had a terrible new teacher who was oblivious to everything and not the greatest teacher. Our class got together and petitioned the school to bring back our retired principal so he could teach the AP version of the class, which is what he had been doing for years until the previous year where he retired. He had taught my brother's class. This is important. 2 years beforehand, and we got him back for his one encore year. This guy was a fantastic teacher, lively, and in your face all the time. We would joke that the first row is the splatter zone, which is where I sat. We had a big midterm and final in the class. It was set up so that it was all multiple choice, and you had a separate answer sheet. I did well on the midterm, but when the final came up, I did not study one bit. In panic, I went through my brother's old notes to see if he had any helpful study guides. Lo and behold, I find his corrected midterm and final answer sheets, so I compare my midterm answer sheet with his. Holy shit. They are nearly identical. For the actual test, all we could have on our desk was a pencil, paper, and a water bottle. Being in the front row, none of these presented very viable cheating options, but I came up with the idea to cut out a circular piece of paper, write all the numbers and answers on it, and then glue it to the inside of my Nalgene cap. It was nerve-wracking being in the front row with him pacing by, and doing my best to not close the cap every time as to not lose suspicious. Got a pretty good grade from what I recall. He changed up a few more answers than he did on the midterm. When me and my brother were attending public Italian high school, we are American but had lived there 4 years, so were fluent in Italian at that point. My brother had to take the final exams to graduate, which are hours long, on every subject studied, and notoriously difficult. He found a website where kids would upload pictures of the tests and tutors would post answers with the work. I was on that website and he would text me with specific questions he couldn't figure out, and I spent hours texting him the answers in text format because I had a flip phone, mainly math problems. Some translation of paragraphs in Latin to Italian, and I had no clue what an integral was, so I would just say things like, tall skinny s with 5 on top and 2 on the bottom, followed by such and such formula. He told me the teachers would go to the smart kids in the back and ask for them to copy answers onto scrap paper that they would drop off to kids that were struggling at the front who couldn't cheat easily because of outside proctors at the front, and teachers were penalized for kids that failed the final, if I remember correctly. The tests were the same nationwide, but varied by type of high school, I believe. Point also, while in Italian high school I would write down all of the formulas I needed for physics tests into the program part of my T84 as text, because I had to show written work, and couldn't just plug it into my calculator and write down an answer. Italian teachers had no clue those calculators could even do such things. It was a mechanical design class, heavy on the math, and involves a lot of problem solving. I was a student, and up until this point I was friends with most cliques in class. We'd often help each other to figure out the concepts anyone had trouble with. Yay, teamwork and all that. That was the kind of culture our class had. If you're done with your own work, you go and help people who are having problems. If someone asks for help, you go and help, because they are likely to return the gesture sometime in the near future. I'll help with anything, so long as 1, I'm not doing your work for you, and 2, you're learning and not just copying. Point. Most of us students showed up to the computer lab early to finish up on a difficult report that was due next class, and help each other figure out whatever problems we had left. Point. Well, this one kid, really smart, had been hanging out with the wrong crowd. They didn't care to be there. Some of them were there because of wealthy parents with demanding expectations, and it easily showed. Now this smart kid comes up to me to ask me if he can see my report. I was finished at this point, so he can figure things out. I say sure, and he walks off. He just needed to see what equations I had used and how I had used them, so he only would have needed it for a minute or two to understand. A few minutes later I go to check to see if he's having trouble, and lo and behold, him and 3 others guys that were notorious for never doing their work had their noses buried in my report, copying down everything, number for number, word for word. I gave them the first polite excuse I could think of, and left with my report in hand. Their eyes followed the report like I had a pair of golden titties in my hands. Normally I wouldn't care, but you see I have a very particular way of doing math and solving problems. I had a unique style that my teachers easily recognized, and our school also had some rather specific rules about plagiarism. If someone copied your work, you were also culpable for being penalized for plagiarism. That report was worth a large portion of our final mark. Something between 10-15% I think. No exam for that class. Well, the next week we got back our marks for that report. But before releasing them, our teacher informed us that the 5 or 6 students who had a 0 mark had been busted for plagiarism and needed to go talk to him after class. Fuck me. Plagiarism doesn't just get you a 0 mark, it also goes on your academic record point. After panicking for a minute or two, I finally got my mark back, and it wasn't a 0. Thank fuck. I look around the class and see those who had tried to copy my report looking like someone had sheet in their shoes. I didn't want to think about what would have happened if we were in a bigger class where the teachers didn't know us personally. We tell a story in EdPsych about this legendary kid who was devoted to cheating. At first he started tame with crib sheets and the like, but after getting caught one too many times, he started focusing on 3 things: efficiency, having big crib sheets is easier to get caught with; effectiveness, cheating is worthless if your answers are wrong; and stealthiness, to avoid getting caught in the first place. He would do things like write a mnemonic for answers in an abbreviated code, then memorize the key. He would plant these answers in unlikely places that required subtle contortions to view. Eventually, though, the kid realized that his plans were getting too elaborate to be effective, so he needed to simplify. That was his new goal: simple but effective cheating. One day, he came to his teacher, who at this point was more amused than exasperated, and he crowed, "I finally got it. I found the perfect way to cheat, so that I'll always get the right answers and never get caught." "Oh, yeah?" the teacher said. "All I have to do is memorize all the possible answers ahead of time and then write them back perfectly on the test. Genius." The best thing about this story is that the moral is twofold. For the student, it's almost certainly more efficient to use your time actually studying. For the teacher, or, hopefully, administrator and policymaker, it's that the lecture test basis of classroom instruction doesn't actually inculcate knowledge, because student goals aren't usually knowledge oriented. Instead, you are getting cheaters who are highly efficient of memorizing random BS and spitting it back out in specific, highly ritualized testing environments. Not a teacher, but I do remember a situation in one of my math classes over 2 years ago. So my then teacher, this old, 60-ish-year-old woman, had a class of around 36 kids. We were her 5th period group, coming fresh out of lunch, all hyper and whatnot. You had a group of sophomores, me included, in the back, along with seniors on the left, juniors who could give to sheets in the middle, and the ones actually there to do work in the front. This one kid, we'll call him Tony, thought it was a great idea to use the cover of his T83 to cover his phone during a test. It goes well a few times, pretending to work and fill in his answers. Where Tony failed, however, was in his ability to think at all. On a seemingly regular day, Tony starts dozing off during her lecture on graphs and sheet. He feels bored and tempted to play on his phone. The only reason he didn't was because he had been separated from the senior group from the back and was forced to sit in the front, a dead giveaway one would say. Being resourceful, he uses his calculator cover and proceeds to use his phone. All goes well until tragedy strikes. The dummers felt the urge to play Real Racing 2, and since you can't play in portrait mode, he tilts his calculator, giving away the illusion that he was using a real calculator. Teacher walks over, says, "Is that a calculator?" He says, "Oh yeah." She comes closer and removes the cover, subsequently taking the phone. It worked well until boredom struck. Let this be a lesson to you all. I've got some more stories, but those are for another day. Probably a bit late to this thread, but I played a D1 sport at a very competitive university, so the cheating amongst my teammates was nearly rampant. Here are a few of the funny ones. The swine flu was a major concern at the time. Guy went to class and realized that everyone else had blue books, and he realized it was the day of the midterm. Left the class and emailed the professor about how sick he was and that he was concerned about the welfare of his fellow students. Professor let him take the exam later on, and in the meantime he got the question from another guy and filled in a blue book. Got an 8. 2 guys were in an upper div social sciences course and neither of them were bright, so they answered the questions they thought they knew and then copied off one another. Guy A used a word that didn't exist in one of his short answer questions and Guy B copied it down. They took the normal precautions and submitted the exams to different TAs. Over a drink the TAs joked about how dumb the students were and used the word that didn't exist as an example. The other TA shared the same story and they figured it out. Failed the class 3 guys were taking the same upper division humanities course that a fellow teammate took the year before. They individually approached this guy to see his paper, to help themselves along in their research, etc. Needless to say they all changed the guy's name and submitted the paper. Got caught and were suspended for 2 quarters, which was basically our season point. Needless to say, none of these dudes were remotely intelligent. I was a teaching assistant several years ago. There is often a large number of minor plagiarism, i.e., missed citations, failure to quote something, etc., that I usually sternly warn against and dock marks, but rarely fail. We all make mistakes. One student, however, went to great lengths to try and get a good grade on their final essay. The essay was broken into 2 components, an outline and the final product. This student's outline seemed fantastic, almost too good to be true. The thesis was original, thoughtful, and incredibly interesting, and in line with very current research. The student's grades were mediocre previously, but the outline seemed to put in a lot of thought into it. I checked for plagiarism, but couldn't find anything, so I gave them an A. 2 weeks later the final essays come in, and I was excited to read the completed essay. But as I was reading it, it was too good to be true again. The writing was a little wonky, but mostly very good. The content was fantastic, and the secondary research was high quality, ESP considering most didn't use any secondary research. My radar was going off, and I knew something was wrong. About halfway through the essay I realized why it was so familiar. It was a translation of a published essay that I had been working with and translating it for my own research. It was in an uncommon language with a small number of native speakers, i.e., not French, German, Italian, so the student was likely banking on that language not being picked up by the plagiarism checking software. They were right, it didn't, but the student didn't anticipate my knowledge of that language. When I met the student during office hours, I pulled out my copy of the article and began reading it to them untranslated. They stopped me a few sentences in and asked what was going on, and I said something along the lines of, "Oh, I thought you would understand, since you just stole this article and tried to pass it off as your essay." I could see them trying to come up with an excuse quickly, but that failed, and they just admitted they did a search for articles in that language because their roommate could help them translate it. TLDR. Student tried to plagiarize an article from another language, but I spoke that language, and I was familiar with the article in question. The advantages to cheating I had in a private high school were insane. As a freshman, meet a sophomore, and get all the old tests/quizzes beforehand. A+ so and so on up the ladder. Everyone helped everyone else. Old iPads that only displayed music titles. Changed titles to exam answers/notes. Teachers in 2002-2007 or so did not even consider this. I had the iPad 60GB one that could display picture/video, but had the click wheel. I made PowerPoint slides with all notes/answers, and formatted it to my iPad as JPEGs. Wore a jacket, put iPad in sleeve in hand, slid out just the screen. To the teacher they just saw my hand on the desk. Teacher in college encouraged people to listen to music during exams if it helped for concentration. I made audio clips of my voice reading definitions/theories and could quickly find answers to problems. Program all statistics formulas into graphing calculator. Teacher clears programs but can't erase archives. In the case that they could, borrow a second graphing calculator. Have teacher clear it, make the switch as they are busy with another student's calc. Watch calculators. The ultimate nerd machine. My friend figured out how to add formulas in. He would put the watch on his desk to keep track of time. Haha, you are allowed to have a 3x5 card. Write out multiple cards with all the things you need. Hide cards in sleeve. Hold card in hand. Slide it into sleeve using fingers. Act as if you are grabbing the card with your other hand, but grab a different card out. So easy to do. Use the restroom. Have to pee during a test. Place phone and empty pockets. W/E teacher requires go to bathroom, where you have notes taped in some location. Get the answers you need. Return point taking test in lecture hall that is like amphitheater. Sit in the back, place notes on floor, place notes under test. They can't see sheet from their view, especially if you are in the middle 15 rows up with 100 students surrounding you. Use your phone to Google answers. If one seriously, if you're smart about it, they can't see sheet, point edit. Another one for presentations. This takes symbols, but I did it many times, and although the teachers were frustrated by it, they all let it happen. You have a PPT presentation due. You are scheduled to present. The teacher requires you to bring in a copy on a USB drive, maybe also uploaded to them the night before. You haven't done it / it's crappy, and you're not prepared. You put together a crappy set of slides with pics and random bullet points on your comp. Then save 2 copies. The first few slides are legit. The next ones are saved as an invalid format and show up in that crazy computer language, and you freak out in class. You say, I don't know, I'll do this last night. They then go and open the email version. Same thing, copy with a few working slide and the rest corrupt. You then have to save face and pull this off. Say, I have my laptop, pull it up, show her the version with all the working slides, and say, okay, I'll just have it here. Well, the teacher is now blaming the classroom comp and will say, no, we don't have time / people can't see the screen on your comp. You will have to present another day. You have now shown them 2 corrupt files, the one on the USB drive and the emailed version, and an original working file on your comp. Perhaps she says, okay, upload the working one, while another student goes, upload the corrupt one again. This time you just throw your hands up in disgust and say you worked so hard and are going to fail. You say your comp is old, the formats are not working, blah blah blah. Teachers are not that computer savvy or aware of saving it as a PDF or other such things. If they are, simply upload the corrupt version as PDF. This is a last ditch effort, but I guarantee it will work every time. And you save your grade by become distraught and frustrated. So now you have seen others present very good presentations. You now know what the teacher is looking for and can incorporate the slide layouts used by other students. You have put together all the pieces from multiple presentations that will make an A presentation, point edit 2. Sorry, I keep thinking of things to add. The presentation scheme, the class / some students will begin to feel bad for you and try to help. Everyone in the class is giving pointers and ideas on how to troubleshoot, but damn it, they just are not working. This will put the teacher in the position of letting you present another day. Now if you don't believe me or think this is just so out there and over the top, that is the point. What teacher is going to go out of their way to try and disprove the legitimacy of the problem? They won't. The only time I ran into trouble was when the teacher wanted to take home my USB drive to see what the problem was. This is easily corrected by saving the entire corrupt file in an invalid format and rewriting the file name as a PPT or PPTX. They will see the file name, open it up and not know what format it is. Also save an identical file as a true PPT but have one subtle undetectable difference in the title, so the 2 files can coexist. One is saved in a completely invalid format and won't open, the other will open, but with a few working slides and the rest with corrupt looking text and formatting. They will not know what's happening and blame technology. Or they will open it and resave it as a proper PPT, however the file was made with bad slides, so it will still look the same. They may be smart enough to see that you saved one of the files as a hex or some other invalid thing. Well, they can't revert the text to a working format after it's been saved like this. And you have 2 legit copies to back up your claim it was a technology problem. So they will email you or tell you after class, you need to email me a copy no later than 6 PM or whatever. You bought yourself a few hours, but in most cases you bought yourself until the next class, and you know exactly what they are looking for in a PPT presentation. And trust me, they don't have the time, care enough about conspiracy theories to go through all this every time. I promise. Student here didn't exactly cheat during the math exam, just had the question paper beforehand, point it was pure luck. Here's a story: unplanned heist. Loud math teachers held private tuitions at his place regularly for struggling students. Me and my friends never went because we didn't really needed those tuitions as we did pretty okay in math and we were extremely lazy. Point we had this math test scheduled this one day and we hadn't prepared anything, so the Night before, as a last minute desperate move, we decided we had to go to his place for some lessons. The three of us went to the teacher's place, and it was us, him and 3 more girls. Perfect scenario for a potential Gone Wild story. Now, one thing you must know about our teacher is that he was one of the most unprofessional people out there. He used to make his students bring his grocery supplies, milk, eggs, etc., while he took tuitions for the rest. He always used to send those who he thought were completely hopeless in math. Now back to the story. The test is the next morning and we 6 students are at his mercy sitting there at his place when out of the blue he remembers that he has to buy graph papers so the students could use for the test. We asked him why only he had to buy them. He told us that he was the one who wrote the question paper and there was one question which can only be solved using graphs. Now he asks one of us to go to the store and buy some graphs. He even gives keys to his Honda Activa scooter. Now the electric start to his scooter was busted, so we had to kickstart it. This is where our luck kicks in. Friend 1 tried to kickstart it, but failed, and so did friend 2, and so did I. Our teacher was getting impatient, so he asks us to step aside and angrily kicks the lever and the scooter comes to life. He asks us to wait at his place. We go to his place and the immediate thought that crosses our mind as we enter the door is, what if he has a copy of the test paper here? So we start searching for, and guess what? We found it. He actually had a copy of the question paper, so we asked the 3 girls to write the questions down on an A4 sheet as we 3, the boys, were on lookout. They divided the work, and within 10 minutes they had noted down the whole question paper. He came back. We all split after studying for another 15 minutes and photocopied the questions the next day as we got the exact copy of the question paper, and all 6 of us had the biggest smiles on our faces. The teacher later got jailed for molesting an 8th grader. He tried the old accidentally playing porno on the DVD player and asked the girl to do what the girls were doing in the video. The girl ran straight to her parents. As a student, I can tell you, I have cheated in some seriously stupid ways. So stupid that no teacher would ever expect it because of how dumb they were. On one specific and rather humorous situation in my senior year history class, I was basically caught cheating and got away with it. A little background will help the story. My teacher, Mr. R as we will call him, was a teacher I had the previous year for a different history class. This teacher was awesome and a very knowledgeable guy, but he always seemed to have a lot of things on his mind. That being said, sometimes paying attention during every test and to every detail was not extremely high up on his list. To get into it, there was this one time we were having one of our usual tests, 10 questions of fill in the blank, no word bank, and a 5-paragraph essay. Everyone hated doing the essays, but as long as you hit the 3 key points or so that he mentions in class, you would undoubtedly be okay. So it was a normal test, and the way I figured I would cheat was to sit far up on my chair and put my notebook behind my back. When I would see Mr. R look down or stop paying attention, I would open the notebook and look down, revealing all the answers from the review the previous day. This worked flawlessly on many occasions, even though it was extremely stupid and easy to catch on to. When I would glance down, I would move my head as little as possible and just try to move my eyes in the effort to not make any sudden head movements, so I did not attract any extra attention. So this one time I was doing just that, and little did I know, when I would do this, it would make it look like my eyes were closed. Naturally, I had my head propped up on my hand, because that was the normal position for me in school. With the combination of the head being propped and my eyes looking closed, it basically looked as though I was sleeping. Now, this class, it was no secret that just about everyone would cheat. If you did not, you were pretty much seen as an outcast. So there I was, taking a test and cheating, but that is not what it looked like to Mr. R. It seemed as though I was sleeping during a test of all things. So as soon as he noticed, he slowly and quietly got up and started to approach me. Everyone in the class knew what I would do and how I did it, so everyone lost their sheet. Everyone thought I was completely faked. As he was almost to my desk, he said my name, Ed, to which I replied, "May I help you, Mr. R? Can't you see I'm taking a test and trying to concentrate? Can't a guy get some common courtesy, like damn?" Then Mr. R promptly replied with a sorry and returned to his desk. Just about everyone in the class was speechless because they were convinced that I was going down. But this cheater lived to see another day. Sometimes all it takes is a little sass. This teacher was also the teacher that I was cool enough with to openly say, "You have got to be faking kidding me, Mr. R." So with that you can imagine we were pretty cool. As much as he love-hated me. When I was in high school I was in an app chemistry class. The teacher of the class decided to go on a vacation to Mexico a few weeks early and left us with a sub 4 test prep for the midterm worth half our grade. This really pissed me off, so I decided I was going to steal the test. This teacher had a little office in the back of the class where he had a computer. This was in the mid-90s, so he was one of the few teachers who had one in our school. I convinced the sub that I had left a library book in there, and he helps me take the door off the hinges. Once inside I grab a book of the teacher's and say this is my book and offer to put the door back on the hinges. When he wasn't looking I put tape over the door so it won't lock. I come back at lunch and printed the test out and gave it to all the students in the class. I didn't need the test, mainly did it on principle. The rest of the class passed with a 100% and I got a B. We come back from Christmas vacation and we were caught. The teacher sets me down. He knows everything. Ask why I did it. I told him it was because I thought it was wrong for him to leave a sub for us to prep for a test that was half our grade. He asked why I didn't use the test. I told him I don't believe in cheating, cause the purpose of an app class was to prepare me for college, and cheating would defeated the purpose. He smiles told me that he decided to tell the principal that I was not the students who took the test. I never got in trouble for it. TLDR. Stole a test on principle and didn't use it. Teacher respected me for it, lied to cover it up.